Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. A man heard footsteps moving through his living room just after midnight. He stayed still, waiting for them to leave. In the morning, the front door was unlocked and one of his keys was missing. The morning light was cold and thin, filtering through the blinds in horizontal slats that cut across the hardwood floor. He stood in the entryway, his thumb brushing the empty hook where his brass spare key usually hung. There was no sound in the house except for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. He looked down at the deadbolt. It hadn't been forced. There were no jagged scratches around the keyhole, no splintered wood in the doorframe. It had simply been turned from the inside. He walked back into the living room, stepping carefully, his eyes tracing the path he thought he had heard the footsteps take. The rug was a thick, cream-colored wool, resilient enough to mask most indentations, but near the edge of the mahogany coffee table, the pile was crushed in a way that didn't align with his own walking patterns. He knelt, leaning in until his face was inches from the floor. There, trapped in the fibers, was a small, dried fragment of a leaf, a jagged, dark brown piece of an oak leaf, crusted with a fine, grayish silt. He hadn't been hiking in weeks, and the oak trees on his property were at the far edge of the gravel driveway, nearly 50 yards from the porch. The silence of the house felt different now, less like peace and more like a void. He moved toward the kitchen, his socks sliding over the linoleum. On the counter, his laptop sat exactly where he had left it, but as the sun hit the screen at a specific angle, he saw something that stopped his breath. A smudge. A single, partial fingerprint was pressed into the top right corner of the glossy bezel, just beside the built-in webcam. It was a greasy, translucent mark, angled as if someone had used their thumb to gently tilt the screen downward. He did not open the lid. Instead, he looked at the base of the laptop. The charging cable was taut, pulled 2 inches further across the granite than it had been the night before. He followed the cord to the outlet. Beside the plug, resting on the floorboards, was a tiny, rectangular plastic casing, the translucent sliding cover of a micro SD card adapter. He didn't own one. He stood up and began a slow, methodical circuit of the ground floor. He checked the windows first. Each one was locked, the brass latches firmly in place. In the dining room, he noticed a faint, chemical odor, something sharp and sterile, like industrial-grade isopropyl alcohol. It was strongest near the sideboard where he kept his tax documents and various insurance folders. He pulled the top drawer open. The hanging folders looked undisturbed, but as he ran his hand over the tabs, his fingers hit a snag. The folder labeled property deeds and titles was slightly crumpled at the top, the heavy cardstock creased as if it had been grabbed in haste and shoved back into the metal rails. He pulled the folder out and laid it on the dining table. He counted the documents. Everything appeared to be there, but the order was wrong. The primary deed for the house, which always sat at the very back, was now tucked between his homeowner's insurance policy and a utility bill from 3 months ago. He looked closer at the deed. On the bottom corner of the final page, there was a faint, bluish stain, a pinpoint of ink that looked like it had bled from a high-end fountain pen. He didn't own a fountain pen. He moved to the mudroom, the smallest area of the house, which served as a buffer between the kitchen and the garage. The air here was cooler. On the small wooden bench where he changed his shoes, he saw his work boots. They were exactly where he'd placed them, parallel to the wall. But resting on the seat of the bench was a single, silver-colored metal shaving, no larger than a grain of rice. It was a spiral of aluminum, the kind produced by a high-speed drill or a metal cutting tool. He turned toward the door leading to the garage. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening for the hum of the freezer or the shifting of the house's frame. Nothing. He turned the knob. The garage was dim, smelling of gasoline and damp concrete. His car sat in the center, the chrome bumper catching the light from the small overhead window. He walked around the vehicle. On the driver's side rear tire, the valve stem cap was missing. He looked at the ground and found it resting near the back tire. But it wasn't just lying there. It was placed neatly atop a small, folded square of yellow-lined paper. He picked up the paper, his fingers steady despite the chill. It wasn't a note. It was a receipt, or at least a portion of one, torn jaggedly at the top. It was from a local hardware store, dated 3 days ago, 10:44 p.m. The only item listed was M4 stainless hex bolt, bulk. Beneath the item was a handwritten string of 10 digits, a phone number with a local area code. But the last 2 numbers had been crossed out so heavily the ink had nearly torn through the paper. He walked back into the house and closed the garage door, locking it. He went to the basement stairs. The door was a heavy, solid oak slab that usually stayed shut to keep the draft out. Now, it was ajar by less than an inch. He didn't go down. Instead, he looked at the carpeted runner leading to the stairs. There, perfectly centered on the 3rd step down, was his missing house key. It had been placed flat on the fabric, the teeth of the key pointing directly toward the basement. He retreated to the kitchen and finally opened his laptop. The screen flickered to life. He didn't check his email or his bank accounts. He went straight to the system logs. At 1:12 a.m., while he had been lying paralyzed in bed listening to those footsteps, the computer had been awakened from sleep mode. A peripheral device had been plugged into the USB port, a device identified by the system only as mass storage device, serial number 00492. The log showed that 4 files had been copied from his personal records folder. He leaned back. The hum of the laptop fanned the only sound in the room. He looked at the window, noticing for the first time a small, perfectly round hole in the exterior screen, just large enough for a thin wire to pass through. It was positioned exactly level with the interior latch. The intruder hadn't just walked in, they had prepared. He looked back at the key on the basement stairs. It wasn't a forgotten item. It was a marker. He reached for his phone, his eyes never leaving the basement door. He didn't dial the emergency line yet. He opened his camera app and began to photograph the oak leaf, the ink stain, and the silver spiral on the bench, documenting the quiet geometry of a crime that was still, he realized, potentially in progress. The photos were captured with a steady hand, the flash disabled to avoid casting harsh reflections that might obscure the details. He moved back to the kitchen table, his mind working through the sequence of the night. If the computer was accessed at 1:12 a.m., and he had heard the footsteps just after midnight, the intruder had been inside for at least an hour before even touching the electronics. That meant 40 minutes of silent movement through the house. He looked at the kitchen trash can. It was a simple stainless steel bin with a foot pedal. He pressed it down. Resting on top of yesterday's coffee grounds and a crumpled junk mail envelope was a small, discarded item that hadn't been there when he went to bed. It was a single-use antiseptic wipe packet, torn open. He picked it up with a pair of wooden toast tongs. The interior of the packet was still slightly damp. There was no blood on it, only a faint, dark smudge of what looked like graphite or heavy machine grease. His gaze shifted to the hallway leading to the guest bathroom. On the white baseboard, just an inch above the floor, was a faint scuff mark. It was narrow and horizontal, exactly the height of a heavy-duty equipment case wheel. He knelt to examine it. The scuff wasn't black rubber, it was a metallic silver streak. He compared it to the silver spiral shaving he had found in the mudroom. The color matched perfectly. He entered the guest bathroom. The air was cool and smelled faintly of the same industrial alcohol he had detected in the dining room. He looked at the mirror. It appeared clean, but when he leaned in and exhaled, his breath fogged a specific section of the glass. A faint, rectangular outline appeared in the condensation, about the size of a standard identification card. Someone had pressed a card against the glass, perhaps to hold it steady under the vanity light while they photographed it. He checked the medicine cabinet. Everything was in its place. The aspirin, the old bottle of cough syrup, the spare toothbrush. But as he closed the mirrored door, he noticed the small rug on the floor had been shifted. Under the edge of the rug, he found a tiny, translucent plastic clipping. He picked it up. It was the clipped corner of a laminate pouch, the kind used to seal official ID badges. The edge was sharp and fresh. Returning to the living room, he sat on the edge of the sofa, trying to remain as still as the house itself. His eyes fell on the bookshelf. He was a meticulous organizer, keeping his volumes aligned by subject. Between two thick history books, there was a gap that shouldn't have been there. He reached into the void and pulled out a small, black leather-bound ledger. It wasn't his. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat, handwritten columns of dates, GPS coordinates, and strings of alphanumeric codes. On the most recent page, dated 2 days ago, he saw his own home address written in small, precise script. Next to the address was a single word, interlink. Below that, a series of 4-digit numbers that looked like PIN codes. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the backyard. The grass was high, silvered with morning dew. He looked at the old wooden fence that bordered the woods. One of the slats was hanging crookedly. He went outside, the cold dampness of the grass soaking into his socks. At the fence line, he found the source of the oak leaf. The ground was churned up, but not by footsteps. There were 2 distinct, deep ruts in the soft earth, about 4 inches apart, the tracks of a narrow-gauge dolly or a specialized equipment cart. Following the ruts back toward the house, he found a small, discarded piece of heavy-duty black zip tie. It had been snipped clean with a sharp blade. He looked up at the exterior of his house. Nestled in the corner of the eaves, just above the kitchen window, was a small, gray plastic box that he had never noticed before. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards, held in place by a powerful magnetic base. A tiny, fiber-optic cable ran from the box, disappearing behind the cedar siding. He went back inside and retrieved a stepladder from the utility closet. His movements were slow, deliberate. He climbed up and looked at the gray box. It was a signal booster, a high-frequency transmitter designed to bypass local encrypted networks. He didn't touch it. He climbed down and went back to the dining room sideboard. He reopened the folder labeled property deeds and titles. He took out the deed with the blue ink stain. He held it up to the light. The ink wasn't a spill, it was a signature. A very small, very faint forgery of his own initials had been practiced in the white space at the very bottom of the page, nearly invisible to the naked eye. The logic of the intrusion was starting to solidify. This wasn't a simple burglary. The missing key on the basement stairs wasn't a mistake. It was a test of his observation. The microSD adapter, the mass storage logs, the ledger, and the transmitter in the eaves pointed toward a sophisticated data harvesting operation. They hadn't just taken his files, they had left a bridge. He walked to the basement door. He looked at the key resting on the third step. He looked at the gap in the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through the photos he had taken, stopping at the image of the fingerprint on the laptop bezel. He zoomed in. The ridges were clear. He then looked at the blue ink forgery on the deed. The handwriting in the black ledger used the same distinctive K with a loop top that appeared in the forged initials. He realized then that the footsteps he had heard weren't the sound of someone leaving. They were the sound of someone settling in. He looked at the floorboards near the basement door. There, nearly hidden by the shadow of the frame, was a single, fresh drop of that same dark, viscous crimson liquid he had seen in the puddles of the true crime stories he watched. Only this wasn't a story. It was a physical fact, still wet, slowly soaking into the wood. He didn't open the door. He turned off the kitchen lights, sat back down at the table in the darkness, and waited for the morning sun to rise high enough to show him what was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The drop of liquid on the floorboards remained undisturbed, its surface tension holding a perfect, domed shape against the grain of the wood. He didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled a small high-intensity flashlight from his utility drawer and clicked it on, holding it at a low, grazing angle against the floor. In the harsh lateral light, the wet spot took on a different character. It wasn't blood. It was a dark, synthetic lubricant, smelling faintly of sulfur and cold metal, the kind used in precision clockwork or high-end mechanical lock-picking tools. He stood up, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in the silence. He turned his attention back to the dining room sideboard. If someone had been practicing his initials on the deed, they had needed a reference. He opened the bottom drawer, where he kept his old passports and expired driver's licenses. They were there, but the plastic sleeves they sat in felt warm to the touch. He pulled out his passport from 5 years ago. On the very last visa page, there was a tiny, microscopic puncture, a needle-thin hole through the paper that hadn't been there before. He held the passport up to the light. The hole was perfectly circular. He looked at the floor near the sideboard and found a second silver spiral shaving, smaller than the first, nearly a dust mote. It wasn't from a drill. It was from a lathe. Someone was manufacturing something inside the house. He moved to the kitchen and looked at the dishwasher. It was silent, but when he pressed his palm against the front panel, it felt vibrantly warm. He opened it. Inside, on the top rack, sat a single, heavy brass cylinder, about 3 inches long, sparkling with moisture. It wasn't a kitchen utensil. It was a high-security lock core, stripped of its pins. Beside it lay a small, professional-grade ultrasonic cleaner, the kind used by jewelers, plugged into the outlet behind the toaster. It was still humming at a frequency almost too high for the human ear to catch. The intruder wasn't just stealing data. They were retooling the house's physical security from the inside out. He walked back to the basement door. The key on the third step remained his primary focus. He noticed now that the key wasn't his original brass spare. It was a 3D printed resin replica, painted to look like metal. He knelt on the top step and reached down, picking it up with a tissue. The resin was still slightly tacky, smelling of UV cure chemicals. Below the key, tucked into the crease of the carpet, was a small, white thermal receipt from a local self-storage facility. The timestamp was 3:14 a.m., just 2 hours ago. The unit number was 402. Under the Items Accessed section, it listed Climate-Controlled Equipment Locker. He looked back at the basement door. The gap was still there, an inch of darkness. He reached out and pushed the door just a fraction of an inch further. It didn't creak. The hinges had been freshly greased with that same sulfurous lubricant. In the narrow sliver of light from the hallway, he saw a thin, black wire running along the top of the basement stairs, secured by the same black zip ties he had found outside. He followed the wire with his eyes. It led down into the dark, disappearing behind a stack of old moving boxes. Near the boxes, on the concrete floor of the landing, sat a pair of black industrial gloves and a small, handheld thermal imaging camera. The screen of the camera was still glowing dimly, showing a heat map of the kitchen floor he had just been standing on. He realized then that the footsteps hadn't been a person walking away. They were the sound of someone calibrating equipment. He looked at the black wire again. It was vibrating. A steady, low-voltage pulse was traveling through it. He looked at the thermostat on the wall nearby. The digital display was cycling through numbers that didn't make sense. 72, 74, 68, 80, changing every few seconds. He went to the electrical panel in the mudroom. He swung the metal door open. Every breaker was in the on position, but 3 of them had small, copper jumpers bridged across the terminals, bypassing the internal fuses. A small, secondary circuit board had been glued to the side of the panel, its green LED blinking in sync with the transmitter in the eaves outside. He stepped back, his back hitting the cool wall. He looked at the floorboards again. The drop of lubricant was gone. Someone had wiped it away while he was in the mudroom. He hadn't heard a sound. He looked at the basement door. It was closed now, perfectly, silently shut. The key that had been on the 3rd step was back on its hook in the entryway. He walked to the entryway and looked at the hook. The key was there, but when he touched it, it was cold. Not resin, but his actual brass key. They had swapped it back. He looked at his phone. The photos he had taken of the resin key, the lubricant, and the silver shavings were gone. The gallery app showed no items found. The system logs on his laptop, which he had checked only minutes ago, were now blank. The last entry recorded at 10 p.m. the previous night. He sat down on the floor, his eyes fixed on the basement door. In the silence, he heard a new sound, the faint, rhythmic clicking of a high-speed printer coming from directly beneath his feet. He looked at the gap under the door. A single, thin sheet of paper slid out from the darkness, gliding across the hardwood until it tapped against his shoe. He picked it up. It was a high-resolution scan of his own birth certificate, but the name at the top had been digitally altered. It didn't show his name. It showed the name of a man who had been reported missing in Blackwood Creek 30 years ago. Below the name was a single, handwritten line in blue fountain pen ink. The order is correct now. The paper felt heavy in his hand, a high-quality 24-pound bond that was slightly warm from the laser fuser. He stared at the name of the missing man, a name he had seen only on microfilm at the library where he worked, now grafted onto his own legal identity. The blue fountain pen ink was still slightly raised on the page, the pigment not yet fully absorbed into the fibers. He stood up, his movements fluid and silent, and walked to the kitchen window. The sun was higher now, burning off the fog, revealing the sharp, clean lines of the yard. He looked at the stepladder he had used earlier. It was gone. It had been returned to the utility closet. The latch clicked shut. He went to the closet and pulled the handle. The ladder was there, but the rubber feet were damp, and a single, tiny fragment of red plastic, shaved from the handle of a specialized wire stripping tool, rested on the middle step. He returned to the kitchen table and picked up his phone again. It was still blank, but when he turned it over, he noticed a microscopic smear of specialized conductive paste near the charging port. He grabbed a magnifying glass from his junk drawer. Under the lens, he could see that the internal pins of the port had been slightly abraded, a sign that a hardware-level data extraction tool had been physically forced into the device. He walked back to the dining room sideboard. The folders were still there, but he noticed a faint, rectangular indentation on the mahogany surface where the heavy black ledger had been sitting. He ran his fingers over the wood. The dust had been disturbed in a very specific pattern, not a wipe, but a series of small, circular marks, as if the ledger had been fitted with tiny, vibrating rubber feet to prevent it from making noise when moved. He moved to the living room bookshelf. The history books were pushed back into place, but the dust jackets were misaligned by a fraction of an inch. He pulled them out. Tucked behind the books was a small, handheld frequency scanner, its digital display flickering with a list of captured packets. It was intercepting the encrypted signal from his own home security system and rebroadcasting it to the transmitter in the eaves. He sat on the couch, looking at the carpet. In the daylight, he could see a faint, silvery trail, not liquid, but a fine dusting of aluminum powder, leading from the basement door toward the fireplace. He walked to the hearth. The heavy cast-iron grate had been moved. He reached into the chimney flue and felt along the interior ledge. His fingers hit a cold, hard object. He pulled it down. It was a small, high-capacity external hard drive, wrapped in a static shielding bag. Taped to the bag was a printed shipping label addressed to a private residence in a neighboring state, but the sender's name was his own. The date on the label was tomorrow. He realized the scale of the operation wasn't just data theft. It was a total identity overwrite. By the time the Postal Service picked up that drive, every legal and digital record of his existence would point to the man who vanished 30 years ago. He went to the kitchen and looked at the dishwasher again. The brass lock core was gone. In its place was a small, plastic bag containing 3 small, jagged pieces of a broken master key. He picked up the bag. The metal of the key fragments was still warm. He walked to the basement door one last time. He didn't look at the gap or the key on the hook. He looked at the hinges. A tiny, fiber-optic camera lens, no larger than a pinhead, had been threaded through the pin of the top hinge, angled directly at his face. He didn't flinch. He walked back to the kitchen, poured a second glass of water, and watched the gray plastic box in the eaves. The LED on the box changed from green to a steady, solid red. In the silence of the house, the clicking of the high-speed printer beneath the floor stopped. It was replaced by a soft, rhythmic mechanical whir, the sound of a cooling fan inside a server rack. He looked at the birth certificate on the table. The blue ink had finally dried, turning a dark, permanent navy. He picked up a pen of his own and began to write a list on the back of the paper. The coordinates from the ledger, the serial number of the mass storage device, and the unit number from the storage facility receipt. He wasn't waiting for the morning anymore. He was waiting for the mail to arrive. The sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows that no longer hid the finer details of the room. He sat with the black ledger, the birth certificate, and the shipping label arranged in a neat row. He began to cross-reference the alphanumeric strings in the ledger with the dates in his own digital calendar from 3 years ago, the year he had moved into the house. The strings weren't encryption keys. They were utility account numbers, property tax IDs, and old permit registrations. He walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a box of documents left by the previous owner, a retired civil engineer who had passed away shortly after the sale. He found the original blueprint for the house. It was a standard 1970s build, but the engineer had hand-drawn a modification in the basement, a reinforced storage vault beneath the garage floor, originally intended for a heavy-duty backup generator. He looked at the birth certificate again. The name Arthur Vance was the man who had vanished in 1994. He remembered a detail from the old library archives. Vance hadn't been a drifter. He had been a junior clerk at the county records office. He moved back to the basement door. He didn't enter. Instead, he went outside to the garage. He knelt on the concrete floor and began to tap. Near the back wall, behind a stack of winter tires, the sound changed from a dull thud to a hollow, metallic ring. He cleared the area and found a seam in the concrete, filled with a dark, flexible sealant that looked identical to the industrial lubricant he had found on the floorboards. Using a flathead screwdriver, he pried up a small, circular cap. Underneath was a modern, high-security electronic lock, the very one he had seen the brass core for in the dishwasher. He didn't try to open it. He looked at the serial number etched into the casing, TX 9904. He returned to the house and used his laptop to search the local business registry, not for a name, but for that serial number. It was registered to a small security firm called Vance and Associates, which had been dissolved in late 1994, only weeks after the disappearance. The firm's last known address was the same self-storage facility from the receipt, Unit 402. The logic shifted from an intrusion to a long-term residency. Arthur Vance hadn't vanished into the woods. He had vanished into the infrastructure of the county itself. As a records clerk, he had the access to delete himself and then reauthor himself into the blind spots of property deeds. The engineer who lived here before had likely been a silent partner, or perhaps a victim of the same slow identity overwrite. He looked at the shipping label. The destination address was a small cottage in a town 3 hours away. He searched the property records for that address. It was owned by a holding company whose primary shareholder was a man named Thomas Miller, the name of the librarian he had researched earlier. The librarian and the records clerk were the same person, cycling through identities every 15 to 20 years to stay ahead of the digital trail. He went to the kitchen and looked at the refrigerator. Behind a magnet for a local pizza place was a small, handwritten note he had never noticed. It was a maintenance schedule for the HVAC system, dated 5 years ago. The handwriting matched the ledger perfectly. The intruder wasn't a stranger. He was the person who had essentially built the house's internal systems. He sat back down at the table. The 3D printed key, the conductive paste on the phone, and the hardware-level data extraction were the tools of someone who didn't want money. They wanted a clean life. By transferring his data to the hard drive and shipping it to the next house, the man in the basement was preparing to move again, leaving behind a dead identity and stepping into a new one. The footsteps he had heard weren't an attack. They were the sound of a man packing a suitcase. He picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the county sheriff. He didn't report a home invasion. He reported a historical records discrepancy and provided the serial number of the lock and the unit number of the storage facility. He explained, in a calm, flat voice, that he had found physical evidence of a long-term habitation in a non-permitted basement vault. As he spoke, he heard the soft, final click of the basement door latch. A small, brass key, his actual spare, slid out from under the door, coming to rest on the hardwood. It was a quiet, clinical surrender. There were no shouts, no struggle. 10 minutes later, a single patrol car pulled into the driveway, its blue lights soft in the afternoon sun. He watched from the window as a gray-haired man, looking exactly like a librarian, walked out of the garage with his hands empty, carrying nothing but a small black leather-bound ledger. The mystery of Blackwood Creek didn't end with a scream. It ended with a ledger being handed over and a door finally being locked from the outside. Case 2. A package was marked as handed directly to the resident. The resident hadn't opened the door that day. The delivery photo showed the door slightly open from the inside. Sarah stood in her kitchen, staring at the notification on her phone. The package had arrived at 2:47 p.m. She knew this because she'd checked the tracking obsessively, a habit from years of waiting for important parcels. But she hadn't been home at 2:47 p.m. She'd been at work 40 minutes away in a meeting that didn't end until 3:15. The photo attached to the delivery confirmation showed her front door. It was unmistakably hers, the brass knocker she'd installed last summer, the small crack in the upper left corner of the frame from when she'd bumped it with a ladder. But the door was open, not wide open, just a few centimeters, enough to see a sliver of her dark hallway beyond. She'd checked the door when she came home at 5:30. It had been locked. She was certain of that. She always locked it, even when leaving for just an hour. The deadbolt had clicked into place with its familiar resistance. Now, standing in her kitchen with the box on the counter in front of her, Sarah tried to reconstruct the afternoon. The package was there. The delivery driver had photographed it. But how had they opened the door? She hadn't left a key. She hadn't authorized entry. And more importantly, how had the door been locked when she arrived home if someone had opened it from the inside? She looked at the box. It was a standard brown cardboard container, medium-sized, with her address printed on the label. Nothing unusual. She'd ordered a set of kitchen knives 3 weeks ago. The estimated delivery window had been today. This had to be it. But something felt wrong. Sarah picked up the box. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the dining table and set it down carefully. The tape sealing it was intact, no signs of tampering. The label was clean, undamaged. She examined the edges where the flaps met, running her finger along the seams. Everything appeared normal. She grabbed a knife from her drawer and carefully cut along the tape. The cardboard opened smoothly. Inside, there was a layer of brown packing paper. She pulled it back. The knife set was there, nestled in its white box. 12 pieces, stainless steel, exactly what she'd ordered. She lifted it out and checked underneath. Nothing else in the package. No invoice, no packing slip, which was odd. Usually there was some kind of documentation. Sarah set the knives aside and looked back at the empty box. She turned it over, examining the bottom. The cardboard was slightly discolored in one corner, as if it had been wet at some point. She pressed it with her thumb. It was dry now, but the fibers had a compressed quality that suggested moisture exposure. She thought about the photo again. The door opened from the inside. The delivery driver had somehow gotten in, or someone had let them in, or someone had opened the door before the delivery driver arrived, and it had simply stayed open until the photo was taken. Sarah walked to her front door and examined it more carefully. The lock was a standard deadbolt, nothing sophisticated. The door frame was solid wood, painted white. She ran her hand along the edges, looking for scratches or signs of forced entry. There were none. No tool marks. No splintering. The paint was intact. She pulled the door open and looked at the lock mechanism from the outside. The deadbolt was smooth, unmarred. If someone had picked it, they'd done a professional job. If they'd had a key, well, that was a different problem entirely. Sarah went back inside and closed the door, locking it. She stood in her hallway, looking at the space where the package had been left. The delivery photo showed it sitting on the floor, just inside the threshold, partially visible in the doorway. But the angle was odd. The photo had been taken from inside the house, not from outside. You could tell by the perspective, the way the light fell across the box, the shadow it cast on the hardwood floor. A delivery driver wouldn't step inside to take a photo. That wasn't protocol. They took photos from outside, showing the package on the porch or at the door. This photo had been taken from inside. Sarah's chest tightened. She moved through her house slowly, room by room, looking for anything out of place. The The living room appeared undisturbed. Books on the shelf in their usual arrangement. The television remote on the coffee table, exactly where she'd left it. The throw blanket folded over the back of the couch. In the bedroom, everything seemed normal. The bed was made. Her dresser was untouched. She opened the closet and looked at her clothes, her shoes, her boxes of off-season items. Nothing appeared to have been moved. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something. The window. It was a double-hung window that looked out onto the side of her house, toward the neighbor's yard. It was closed, but the latch was in a different position than usual. She always locked it by pushing the latch down firmly, so it sat flush against the frame. Now it was slightly raised, as if it had been opened and then closed again without being fully secured. Sarah opened the latch and examined it. There were no visible scratches on the mechanism. The paint around the frame was intact, but the window itself, she ran her finger along the inside edge of the sill. There was a faint smudge of dirt, grayish and fine, like dust mixed with something else. Concrete dust, perhaps, or drywall. She looked out the window at the ground below. There was a narrow flower bed beneath it, mostly bare earth and a few struggling shrubs. The soil was dry and compacted. She couldn't see any obvious footprints or disturbance, but the angle from inside made it difficult to see clearly. Sarah closed the window and lashed it properly, pushing down until it was secure. She made a mental note to check it again later, perhaps in better light. In the kitchen, she found something else. A small detail she almost missed. The window above the sink had a slight film of condensation on the inside, even though the house was warm and dry. She touched it with her finger. It was cool. The window had been opened recently, or someone had breathed on it. The condensation was beginning to evaporate, which meant it had been there for a while, but not too long. She opened the window and looked out. The kitchen window faced the backyard. There was a fence about 6 feet tall, with a gate that led to the alley behind her property. She kept the gate locked. She checked it regularly, especially after a break-in at a neighbor's house 2 years ago. From her vantage point at the window, she could see the gate. It was closed, but she noticed something on the fence post next to the gate. A small mark, a fresh scrape in the paint. The wood beneath was light-colored, recently exposed. It looked like something had rubbed against it. A tool, maybe, or a piece of clothing. Sarah closed the window and locked it. She stood at the sink, staring out at her backyard, trying to piece together what might have happened. Someone had been in her house. She was almost certain of it now. The open window in the bedroom. The condensation on the kitchen window. The scrape on the fence post. The delivery photo taken from inside. These weren't coincidences. But nothing had been taken. At least, nothing obvious. She did a quick mental inventory. Her laptop was on the desk in the bedroom. Her jewelry box was on the dresser, unopened. Her television was still there. Her sound system, even her grandmother's silver candlesticks, which she kept on the mantel, were untouched. Unless something had been taken that she wouldn't immediately notice. Something small. Something that wouldn't be missed right away. Sarah went to her bedroom and opened her dresser drawers. She looked through her clothes, checking pockets, examining the arrangement. Everything seemed to be in order. She opened her nightstand drawer. Her reading glasses, a pen, a half-empty bottle of lotion. Nothing missing. In the kitchen, she checked the junk drawer. Rubber bands, twist ties, old takeout menus, a flashlight with dying batteries. She looked through the kitchen cabinets. Dishes, glasses, bowls. All there. All accounted for. She went to the small home office off the living room. Her laptop was closed on the desk. She opened it and checked the browser history. Nothing unusual. No unfamiliar websites visited. She checked her email. No suspicious login attempts. No notifications of unusual activity. But then she noticed something on the desk itself. A pen. She always kept her pens in a cup on the right side of the desk. This pen was on the left side, near the edge. It was one of hers, a black ballpoint with a small dent in the barrel, but it wasn't where she'd left it. Or had she moved it? She tried to remember. She'd been at work all day. She hadn't used her desk since last night, when she'd paid some bills online. She was fairly certain she'd left the pen in the cup. Sarah picked up the pen and examined it. It felt normal. The cap was on. She uncapped it and looked at the tip. The ink was fine, not dried out. She recapped it and set it back in the cup where it belonged. She was probably being paranoid. A pen could be moved by a draft, by vibration from traffic outside, by any number of mundane explanations. But combined with everything else, the open window, the delivery photo taken from inside, the smudge on the windowsill, the scrape on the fence post, it painted a picture of intrusion. Sarah sat down at her desk and pulled out her phone. She opened the delivery app again and looked at the photo more carefully. She zoomed in on the background, trying to see what was visible behind the package. The hallway, a glimpse of the living room beyond, a corner of her bookshelf, and something else. In the lower right corner of the image, partially out of focus, there appeared to be a shoe. A dark shoe, partially visible at the edge of the frame. It looked like a work boot, the kind delivery drivers or contractors wore, but it was inside the house, inside her hallway, which meant that when the photo was taken, someone was standing in her home, wearing work boots, close enough to be captured in the frame. Sarah's hands felt cold. She set the phone down and looked around her office, really looking, trying to see if anything else had been disturbed. The desk lamp was on the left side of the desk. She always kept it on the right. She was sure of it. She used it to read documents, and she positioned it to shine over her left shoulder. She moved the lamp back to where it belonged. In the living room, she noticed that the couch cushions seemed slightly compressed on one end, as if someone had sat there recently. She pressed on them. They were still slightly warm, or perhaps she was imagining it. The house was warm from the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. She checked the kitchen again. The refrigerator, the freezer, nothing was missing. But the ice maker had been used. There were fewer ice cubes in the tray than there had been that morning. She was sure of it. She'd made coffee before work and used 2 cubes. Sarah stood in her kitchen, feeling the weight of small violations accumulating. Not theft, not obvious destruction, but intrusion, presence. Someone moving through her space, using her things, leaving traces. She thought about the delivery driver. The photo showed a work boot. The package had been delivered at 2:47 p.m. The delivery had been authorized. The tracking information confirmed it. But the photo had been taken from inside the house, which meant the driver had either been let in by someone, or they had entered without permission, or they had been part of something larger. A coordinated entry. Someone opening the house from the inside, allowing access, facilitating the delivery in an unusual way. Sarah walked to her front door and examined the lock again. She looked at the deadbolt, the door frame, the hinges. Everything appeared normal, but she had a sudden thought. She pulled out her phone and called the delivery company. The customer service representative answered after a brief hold. Sarah explained the situation, the delivery photo taken from inside her house, the door open, the unusual angle of the image. "Let me look into that for you," the representative said. She heard the sound of typing. "Okay, I'm seeing the delivery confirmation here. The package was marked as handed directly to the resident at 2:47 p.m. The photo was uploaded by the driver at that time. But I wasn't home," Sarah said. "I was at work." There was a pause. "Well, the driver logged it as handed directly to the resident. That means someone accepted the package. But I wasn't there, Sarah repeated. No one was there. Is it possible someone else in your household accepted it? I live alone. Another pause. That's concerning. Let me escalate this. Can you confirm that the package you received matches the tracking information? Sarah looked at the box on her dining table. Yes, it's the knife set I ordered. Everything seems to be in order. Okay, I'm going to flag this for our security team. They'll want to review the driver's account and the photo. In the meantime, I'd recommend checking your home for any signs of theft or intrusion. Sarah thanked her and ended the call. She sat down at the dining table and stared at the box of knives, at the empty cardboard, at the packing paper she'd pulled aside. The driver had claimed to hand the package directly to a resident, but the photo showed the door open from the inside and the shadow of a work boot in the hallway. Either the driver had entered the house without permission or someone else had let them in. And if someone else had been in the house, opening doors and using her things, then the question became, why? Sarah stood up and walked through her house again, this time looking for something she might have missed, something that would explain the intrusion, something that would tell her what had really happened at 2:47 p.m. when she was 40 minutes away at work, in a meeting, completely unaware that someone was moving through her home. She found herself back in the bedroom, looking at that window with the raised latch. She opened it again and looked out at the flower bed below. The soil was dry and undisturbed, as far as she could see. But she noticed something she'd missed before, a small piece of fabric caught on the corner of the window frame. It was dark blue, synthetic material, like the kind used in work uniforms or contractor clothing. She carefully extracted it and held it up to the light. It was about the size of a postage stamp, torn at one edge. The other edge was frayed, as if it had been caught and pulled. Sarah set it down on the windowsill and took a photo with her phone. Then she carefully placed the fabric in a small envelope she found in her desk and labeled it with the date and time. She wasn't sure why she was collecting evidence. She wasn't sure she even had a crime to report yet. But something told her that these small details mattered, that they would eventually tell a story about who had been in her house and why. She closed the window and locked it, checking the latch twice to make sure it was secure. Then she walked to her front door and did the same thing, testing the deadbolt, checking for weakness or vulnerability. The house felt different now. Spaces she'd always felt safe in now seemed permeable. Boundaries she'd assumed were solid now seemed fragile. Someone had crossed the threshold. Someone had been here, had moved through these rooms, had touched her things. And the worst part was not knowing why, not knowing what they'd wanted, not knowing if they were still coming back. Sarah sat on her couch and looked around her living room, really studying it, trying to see it through the eyes of someone who didn't belong here. What would catch their attention? What would be worth taking? What would be worth the risk of breaking in? She thought about the ice cubes. The pen moved from the cup, the lamp repositioned, the window latch raised. These were small things, barely noticeable, the kind of things you might attribute to your own forgetfulness or the natural settling of a house. But taken together, they suggested something deliberate, something careful, someone who had been in her house, who had moved through it methodically, who had tried to leave as little trace as possible. Sarah pulled out her phone and looked at the delivery photo one more time. She zoomed in on the work boot in the corner of the frame. It was definitely a boot, heavy-soled, dark-colored, the kind worn by construction workers or delivery personnel. But the foot was turned at an odd angle, as if the person wearing it had been standing sideways, partially out of frame. She wondered if the driver had taken the photo intentionally, capturing themselves in the image, or if it had been an accident. Either way, it was evidence. Physical proof that someone other than herself had been in her home at 2:47 p.m. Sarah decided to check her security camera. She had one mounted above the front door, a basic model that recorded to the cloud. She'd installed it after the neighborhood break-ins, though she rarely checked the footage. She opened the app on her phone and navigated to today's recordings. She scrolled back to 2:40 p.m. and pressed play. The video showed her front door and the small porch in front of it. The timestamp ran in the corner. At 2:45, a delivery truck pulled up to the curb. A man in a blue uniform got out, carrying a package. He walked up the path toward her door. Sarah watched as he approached. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair. He wore the standard delivery company uniform, blue shirt, dark pants, heavy boots. He carried the brown box in both hands. At 2:47, he reached her door. He looked at the house number, then at the package label. He seemed to be confirming the address. Then he did something that made Sarah's breath catch. He reached out and tried the door handle. The door was locked, so it didn't open. But then he stepped back and looked at the door, as if considering something. He set the package down on the ground. For a moment, nothing happened. The driver stood there, looking at the door. Then, slowly, the door began to open. Not wide, just a few centimeters, as if someone inside was pulling it open. Sarah watched, frozen. Someone was in her house. Someone was opening the door from the inside to let the delivery driver in. The driver picked up the package and moved toward the open door. The video showed him stepping inside, his form disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. The door remained open for another 30 seconds. Then it began to close slowly, as if being pushed shut from inside. The video ended at 2:48. Sarah sat in stunned silence, watching the empty porch, the closed door, the timestamp frozen at 2:48 p.m. Someone had been in her house. Someone had opened the door for the delivery driver. Someone had been waiting for that package. And Sarah had no idea who they were. Sarah rewound the video and watched it again. And again, each time, the same sequence of events unfolded. The delivery driver approaching, the attempt to open the locked door, the pause, then the door opening from inside, pulled by an unseen hand. She checked the timestamp on her phone. 2:47 p.m. She'd been in a meeting at work. She could verify this. She had the calendar invite, the meeting notes, the email chain from that afternoon. But that didn't change what the video showed. Someone had been in her house. Sarah's first instinct was to call the police. But she hesitated. What would she tell them? That someone had opened her door for a delivery driver? That her ice maker had fewer cubes than before? That a pen had been moved? That there was a small piece of blue fabric caught on a window frame? It sounded paranoid. It sounded like the complaints of someone who'd watched too much television. But the video was real. The video showed someone opening the door from inside. She decided to wait, to gather more information, to understand what had actually happened before involving the authorities. Sarah stood up and walked through her house again, but this time with a different focus. She wasn't looking for things that had been moved. She was looking for things that had been taken, things that might have been the purpose of the intrusion. She went to her bedroom and opened the dresser again. She pulled out each drawer slowly, examining the contents. Socks, underwear, t-shirts, jeans. Everything seemed to be there. But as she was closing the bottom drawer, she noticed something. A small gap at the back where the drawer met the frame. It was barely visible, but it suggested that something had been removed from behind the drawer. Sarah pulled the drawer out completely and set it on the bed. She reached into the empty space and felt along the back of the dresser. Her fingers found something, a small indentation, a space where something had rested. It was dusty, undisturbed except for the recent disturbance of her searching. She looked in the drawer again, examining the back panel. There was a seam where the back panel met the sides of the drawer. It looked like it might be removable. She pressed on it gently, and it gave slightly. Someone had opened this drawer and accessed the space behind it. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. A hidden compartment, or at least a space that someone had known about and had accessed. But what had been kept there? What had been taken? She thought about the previous owners of the house. She'd bought it 3 years ago from an older couple who'd been moving to be closer to their grandchildren. They'd left it in good condition, mostly empty. She'd never asked about hidden spaces or anything unusual about the house. But someone else had known about this space. Someone had come into her house, opened her dresser, and accessed whatever had been kept behind the back panel. Sarah pushed the drawer back in place and stood up. She looked around the bedroom with new eyes. If there was a hidden compartment in the dresser, what else might be hidden in this house? What else might someone have been looking for? She went to the closet and examined it carefully. The shelves, the rod, the floor. Nothing unusual. She moved to the nightstand and opened each drawer. Nothing. She checked under the bed. Nothing. In the living room, she examined the bookshelf. The books seemed to be in order, but she noticed that the back panel of the shelf, the wall it was mounted against, had a slightly different texture than the rest of the wall. It was almost imperceptible, but there was a faint outline, as if something had been mounted there and then removed. Sarah ran her hand along the outline. It was rectangular, about 30 centimeters wide and 50 centimeters tall. A safe, perhaps, or a hidden panel. Whatever it was gone now. She checked the kitchen cabinets again, but this time she pulled them out and looked at the backs. Nothing. She checked the pantry, the drawers, the space under the sink. Nothing obvious. But in the basement, she rarely went down there, preferring to store things in the upstairs closets. She found something interesting. The basement was unfinished, just concrete floors and exposed beams. She'd used it for storage, boxes of old documents and off-season items stacked against the walls. One of the boxes had been opened. She could see the tape had been cut, the flaps pulled back. She approached it cautiously and looked inside. It contained old tax returns and financial documents from before she'd bought the house, clearly left by the previous owners. She looked at the other boxes. Most were sealed with tape, undisturbed, but 3 others had been opened. All of them contained old documents, financial records, property deeds, correspondence. Someone had been searching through the previous owner's papers, looking for something specific, something that might have been hidden in this house before Sarah had ever moved in. Sarah sat down on the basement stairs, trying to process this. The intrusion wasn't about her. It wasn't about her possessions or her life. Someone had broken into her house looking for something that had belonged to the previous owners, something that they believed was still here, and they'd found a way in. They'd known about the hidden compartment in the dresser. They'd known about whatever had been mounted on the living room wall. They'd known about the boxes of documents in the basement, which meant they either had a key or they had information about the house from someone who did. Sarah went back upstairs and looked at the delivery photo again. The work boot in the corner of the frame. The driver had been wearing boots. But had the driver been the one to open the door from inside? Or had the driver simply been delivering a package to someone who was already in the house? She thought about the notification. The package had been marked as handed directly to the resident. But Sarah was not the resident who'd accepted it. Someone else had been living in her house. Someone who'd been waiting for that package. Sarah pulled up her email and searched for the delivery confirmation. The notification had come from the delivery company's automated system. It didn't specify who had signed for the package, just that it had been delivered and left with the resident. She called the delivery company again and asked to speak to a supervisor. After being transferred twice, She was connected to a manager named David. "I need information about the delivery that was made to my address today," Sarah said. "Specifically, I need to know who signed for the package." "Let me look that up," David said. She heard typing. "Okay, I'm seeing the delivery confirmation. It shows the package was handed directly to the resident. Our driver would have had the recipient sign for it or confirm receipt. Can you tell me what name was used? Or give me a copy of the signature?" "I don't have access to the signature from here, but I can pull up the driver's notes." "Let me see." The driver notes say, "Handed to resident. No signature required." "That's odd. Usually we require a signature for packages of that value." "What value?" Sarah asked. "The package was insured for, let me see, $2,000. Sarah felt her stomach drop. $2,000? For kitchen knives? Let me check the item description. It says kitchen knife set, 12 pieces, stainless steel. That doesn't match the insurance value. So either the insurance was wrong or the package contents are wrong," Sarah said. "That's possible. Or the insurance was set incorrectly when the package was processed. Let me escalate this to our fraud department. They'll want to investigate." Sarah ended the call and looked at the box of knives on her dining table. She opened it again and examined the contents more carefully. The knife set was real. The box was legitimate. But the insurance value was 10 times what the knives should have cost. Unless the knives weren't the real contents of the package. Sarah removed the knife set from the box and examined the interior more carefully. The white box was standard packaging, nothing unusual. She looked at the bottom, the sides, the flaps. Nothing hidden, nothing unusual. But then she noticed something. The weight. The knife set felt lighter than it should. She pulled the knives out and examined them individually. They felt thin, hollow almost. She picked up the largest knife, a chef's knife, and held it up to the light. The blade was dull, not the dull of a knife that had been used and needed sharpening. The dull of metal that wasn't quite right. She ran her finger along the edge. It was smooth, not sharp at all. These weren't real knives. They were replicas. Cheap metal painted to look like stainless steel. Sarah set the knife down and looked at the rest of the set. All of them had the same hollow feeling, the same dull finish. They were all fakes. So someone had ordered a package containing counterfeit knives, insured it for $2,000, and had it delivered to Sarah's address. Someone had been waiting in Sarah's house to receive it. Someone who had a key or knew how to break in without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. This wasn't a burglary. This was a mail fraud scheme. And Sarah's house was being used as a drop point. Sarah sat down hard on the couch. She thought about the previous owners. Had they been involved in something illegal? Had they left something behind that made this house valuable to criminals? Or had someone simply chosen this house at random, scouted it, found a way in, and decided it would be a good location for receiving packages? She thought about the video again. The delivery driver had tried the door. It was locked. Then someone inside had opened it, which meant that whoever was inside had been watching for the driver, had been expecting the delivery. Sarah went back to the basement and looked at the opened boxes again. She pulled out some of the documents and examined them. Tax returns from 2018 and 2019. Property deeds. A mortgage statement. All in the name of Robert and Margaret Chun, the previous owners. She searched through the documents looking for anything unusual. Anything that might explain why someone would be interested in this house. But the documents seemed routine. Financial records of a normal, middle-class life. Then she found something. A letter tucked into one of the folders. It was dated 3 years ago, just before the Chins had sold the house. The letter was from a law firm, addressed to Robert Chun. Sarah pulled it out and read it carefully. "Dear Mr. Chun," it began. This letter is to confirm our conversation regarding the settlement of your account. As discussed, the agreed-upon amount of $50,000 will be transferred to your account within 30 days of the execution of this agreement. Please note that this settlement is contingent upon your cooperation in providing the documentation outlined in Appendix A. Any failure to provide said documentation will result in forfeiture of the settlement and potential legal action. The letter was signed by an attorney named James Morrison from a firm called Morrison & Associates. Sarah read it again, trying to understand what it meant. Robert Chun had settled something for $50,000, and he'd agreed to provide documentation. But what documentation? And what had he settled? She looked through the rest of the documents in the box, searching for Appendix A, but it wasn't there. The letter referenced it, but the actual appendix was missing. Sarah set the letter aside and continued searching through the boxes. In the third box, she found something else. A ledger, a small notebook with handwritten entries in blue ink. The entries were dated and numbered, with amounts written next to them. The entries started 3 years ago and went forward. They listed names, dates, and amounts. Some amounts were very large, 50,000, 75,000, 100,000. Others were smaller, 500, 1,000, 2,000. The most recent entry was dated just before the house was sold. It listed a name, R. Chun, and an amount of $50,000, with a notation, final payment. Documentation provided. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the ledger. This was a record of payments, a record of transactions. This was evidence of something illegal. She flipped through the pages, looking at the pattern. The entries seemed to represent a series of payments made over time. Some names appeared multiple times, suggesting ongoing transactions. Others appeared only once, and there was a pattern to the amounts. Larger payments were often followed by smaller payments, as if the initial payment was being divided or redistributed. Sarah thought about the letter from the law firm. Robert Chun had settled something and provided documentation. The ledger showed a $50,000 payment to R. Chun. It seemed like the settlement amount and the final payment were related. But what had Robert Chun been involved in? What documentation had been so valuable? Sarah set the ledger down carefully and looked at the other items in the box. There were more documents, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, receipts. All of them related to Robert Chun. All of them suggesting financial activity that went beyond the normal expenses of a homeowner. She found a bank statement from 3 years ago. It showed a wire transfer of $50,000 being received on the exact date mentioned in the law firm's letter. The wire had come from an account labeled Morrison Legal Services. Sarah photographed the ledger and the bank statement with her phone. She photographed the letter from the law firm. She photographed everything that seemed relevant. Then she put all the documents back in the boxes and carried them upstairs. She set them in her bedroom closet, where they'd be less visible but still accessible. She sat on her bed and thought about what she'd discovered. Someone had been in her house. Someone had been looking for something. That something was likely related to Robert Chun and whatever he'd been involved in. The counterfeit knife package was just the latest piece of the puzzle. Someone had discovered that Sarah's house was a good location for receiving packages. Someone had either found a way to copy the key that Robert Chun had used, or they'd found a way to pick the lock or bypass the security system. And they'd been using her house as a drop point for fraudulent deliveries. Sarah realized she needed to check her security system. She had a basic alarm system that she'd installed when she moved in. It had motion sensors and door/window sensors. If someone had broken in, it should have registered. She went to the keypad in the hallway and checked the log. The system showed no breaches. No doors or windows opened. No motion detected when the system was armed, which meant one of three things. Either the system hadn't been armed when the intruder entered, or the intruder had disabled the system, or the intruder had a key and had disarmed the system using the correct code. Sarah checked her security system settings. The alarm code was a standard 4-digit code that she'd set when she installed the system. She'd never changed it. She'd never given it to anyone. But the system's activity log didn't show any failed attempts to disarm it. It showed no attempts at all, which meant either the system hadn't been armed or someone had used the correct code. Sarah felt a chill run through her. If someone had the correct code, they had inside information. They either knew her, or they'd obtained the information from someone who did, or they'd gotten it from the previous owners. She thought about the installation. The security company had set up the system and had given her the code. But who else might have known the code? The installer, the company representative, the previous owners, if they'd kept a copy. Sarah pulled up the security company's contact information and called them. She asked to speak to someone about her system's history. "I'd like to know if anyone other than myself has accessed my security system," she said, "or if there's a way for someone to know my alarm code." The representative put her on hold and then came back with information. "According to our records, your system was installed 3 years ago. The installer set up the code and provided it to you. There's no record of anyone else accessing the system remotely. However, the previous owner would have had the code before the system was transferred to your name. Is there a way to change the code so the previous owner can't access it?" Sarah asked. "Actually, when you took ownership of the house, you should have changed the code. The previous owner's code would still work unless you changed it." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The previous owner's code still worked, which meant Robert Chun, or anyone he'd given the code to, could still disarm her alarm system. "I need to change my code immediately," Sarah said. The representative walked her through the process. Sarah changed her alarm code to a new 4-digit sequence that she'd never used before. She also updated her security system settings to require a PIN for any changes. After she hung up, Sarah sat down and tried to piece everything together. Robert Chun had been involved in something illegal. He'd settled a legal matter and provided documentation to a law firm. He'd received a large payment, and he'd kept a ledger of other transactions, suggesting he might have been involved in facilitating payments or transfers for other people. When he'd sold the house, he'd left behind evidence of his activities, documents, a ledger, a record of his involvement in whatever scheme he'd been part of. Someone had discovered that this evidence existed. Someone had decided that Robert Chen's house, now Sarah's house, was a good place to look for it. And when they didn't find what they were looking for in the documents, they decided to use the house for their own purposes. The counterfeit knife package was a test run, a way to see if the house was a viable location for receiving packages. If it worked, there would be more packages, more fraudulent deliveries, more use of Sarah's address for illegal activities. Sarah realized she needed to go to the police. She had evidence now. The video showing someone opening the door from inside, the counterfeit knives, the documents related to Robert Chun, the ledger, the letter from the law firm. But before she went to the police, she needed to understand one more thing. She needed to know how the intruder had gotten in. Sarah went back to the bedroom window where she'd found the piece of blue fabric. She examined the window frame carefully, looking for signs of tampering. The latch was simple, a basic mechanism that could probably be opened from outside with the right tool. She looked at the sill again, where she'd found the gray smudge of dust. She examined it more closely under better light. It wasn't just dust. It was a fine powder, grayish white, with a slightly grainy texture. It looked like concrete dust or drywall dust. Sarah thought about the scrape she'd seen on the fence post. the mark where something had rubbed against the painted wood, and the piece of blue fabric caught on the window frame. Someone had come from the backyard. They'd climbed the fence or used a ladder to access the bedroom window. They'd opened the window from outside using a tool to manipulate the latch. They'd entered the house through the window. The concrete dust suggested they'd used a tool, perhaps a pry bar or a screwdriver, to open the window. The tool had scraped against the fence post as they carried it. A piece of their clothing had caught on the window frame as they climbed through. Once inside, they'd used the alarm code, the old code from when Robert Chen owned the house, to disarm the security system. They'd searched the house, looking for whatever Robert Chen had hidden. Sarah sat at her desk with the ledger in front of her and her laptop open. She searched for Morrison & Associates law firm and found their website. It was a small firm specializing in settlement agreements and dispute resolution. James Morrison was listed as the senior partner. She looked at the firm's address. It was downtown, about 15 minutes from her house. She thought about calling them, but decided instead to visit in person. She wanted to see their offices, to get a sense of who they were dealing with. But first, she needed to understand the ledger better. The entries were coded, using initials instead of full names. She spent an hour going through the document, trying to match the initials to the names she'd found in the other documents. Most of the entries used single initials or two-letter abbreviations, but one name appeared repeatedly in full: R. Chun. Robert Chen's entries were scattered throughout the ledger, dating back 5 years. The amounts varied, but they were consistently large: 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. Then, 3 years ago, the entries stopped. The last entry for R. Chun was the $50,000 settlement payment. After that, his name never appeared again. Sarah searched through the documents for other names that appeared in the ledger. She found a few: M. Torres, D. Patel, J. Williams, but without full context, she couldn't determine what their involvement had been. She decided to search online for the names combined with the law firm. She started with James Morrison & Associates. What she found was a news article from 2 years ago. The headline read, "Local law firm under investigation for fraud." Sarah clicked on the article and read it carefully. Morrison & Associates, a local law firm specializing in settlement agreements, is under investigation by federal authorities for allegedly facilitating fraudulent settlement schemes. According to sources, the firm may have been involved in arranging settlements for individuals involved in insurance fraud, money laundering, and other financial crimes. The investigation was initiated after several clients reported that they were promised large settlement payments in exchange for providing documentation that would be used to support false insurance claims. The firm allegedly worked with a network of individuals to create fraudulent documentation and submit false claims to insurance companies. Senior partner James Morrison could not be reached for comment. The firm's offices were closed as of yesterday, and it is unclear whether the firm is still operating. Sarah read the article again, trying to connect it to what she'd found. Robert Chun had settled something with Morrison & Associates. He'd provided documentation. He'd received $50,000. Had Robert Chun been involved in insurance fraud? Had he been part of the network that Morrison & Associates had been operating? She searched for more recent news about the investigation. She found another article from 6 months ago, reporting that James Morrison had been arrested and charged with wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The article stated that Morrison had pleaded guilty to some charges and was cooperating with authorities. But there was no mention of Robert Chun, no indication that he'd been investigated or charged with anything. Sarah thought about the settlement letter. This settlement is contingent upon your cooperation in providing the documentation outlined in Appendix A. It sounded like Robert Chun had been offered a deal. Provide the documentation, receive the settlement, and avoid prosecution. And apparently, it had worked. Robert Chun had settled, provided whatever documentation was needed, received his $50,000, and then sold his house and moved away. Sarah searched for Robert Chun's current location. She found a LinkedIn profile for a Robert Chun who worked in real estate in a different state. The profile showed he'd moved to Arizona 3 years ago. The timeline matched. She tried to find more information about what Robert Chun had been involved in. She searched for insurance fraud cases from 5 years ago, looking for any mention of his name. Nothing came up, but she did find something else. A court record from 5 years ago, documenting a settlement agreement between Robert Chun and an insurance company. The document was heavily redacted, with large sections blacked out. But the header was visible. Settlement agreement. Confidential. The settlement had been for $30,000. The date was 3 years before Robert Chun had settled with Morrison and Associates. Sarah realized that Robert Chun had been involved in multiple settlements. The first one, 5 years ago, for $30,000. The second one, 3 years ago, for $50,000. Both had been settlements with insurance companies or their representatives. And between those two settlements, he'd kept a ledger documenting transactions with other people. People with initials like M, Torres, D, Patel, and J. Williams. Sarah thought about the piece of blue fabric she'd found on the window frame. The work boot in the delivery video. The person who'd opened the door from inside her house. That person had been looking for something. They'd searched the basement, looking through Robert Chun's old documents. They'd opened the hidden compartment in the dresser. They'd removed whatever had been mounted on the living room wall. What had they been looking for? The ledger? The settlement documents? Or something else entirely? Sarah realized that the ledger was probably valuable to whoever had broken in. It contained a record of transactions, names, amounts, dates. It was a map of the network that had been operating. And if someone was willing to break into a house to look for it, that meant the ledger was still relevant. That meant the network was still operating. Sarah thought about the counterfeit knife package. It had been insured for $2,000, but it contained fake knives worth maybe $50. The difference, $1,950, was the profit from the scheme. But that was a small amount. Insignificant, really, unless it was part of a larger operation. Unless there were dozens of packages being sent to dozens of addresses, each one generating a small profit through insurance fraud. Sarah opened her email and searched for any other delivery notifications. She found nothing. The knife package was the only delivery to her address in the past year. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be more. If the intruder had determined that her house was a viable location for receiving packages, they would use it again. They would send more packages, each one insured for more than its actual value, each one generating a small profit through the insurance claim. Sarah realized she needed to go to the police, not just because someone had broken into her house, but because her house was being used as part of an ongoing fraud scheme. She gathered the evidence, the ledger, the documents, the photographs of the video, the counterfeit knives. She put everything in a folder and prepared to go to the police station. But before she left, she decided to do one more thing. She decided to call the number on the Morrison and Associates letterhead. The phone rang twice before someone answered. A woman's voice, professional and measured. Morrison and Associates. How can I help you? I'm calling about Robert Chun, Sarah said. I have some documents that relate to a settlement he made with your firm. There was a pause. I'm sorry, we're not accepting new clients at this time. The firm is currently closed. I understand. But I have information about a settlement agreement from 3 years ago. I think it's important. Another pause. Can I ask who you are and how you obtained this information? My name is Sarah. I own the house that Robert Chin used to own. I found some documents he left behind. I'm trying to understand what they relate to. I see. And what documents are you referring to? A settlement letter from James Morrison, and a ledger with transaction records. Sarah heard the woman's breathing change. It became slightly faster, more shallow. Miss Sarah, I would advise you not to discuss those documents with anyone. Those are confidential materials. If you have them, you should return them to Mr. Chin immediately. I can't do that. I don't know where he is. Then you should contact the law firm's office and arrange for their return. In the meantime, I would strongly suggest that you do not share them with anyone else. Who am I speaking with? Sarah asked. That's not relevant. But I'm telling you this for your own safety. Those documents are sensitive. There are people who would be very interested in recovering them. You should not have them in your possession. The line went dead. Sarah sat with the phone in her hand, her heart racing. The woman had hung up on her, and she'd made a threat, or at least a warning. There are people who would be very interested in recovering them. Sarah realized that the person who'd broken into her house hadn't been acting alone. They'd been part of a larger organization, and when they hadn't found the ledger and the documents, they'd reported back to someone who knew about the documents, someone who was willing to threaten Sarah to get them back. The counterfeit knife package suddenly made sense. It wasn't a test run. It was a message, a way of saying, we know where you are. We know what you have. We're watching. Sarah made a decision. She was going to the police. She was going to hand over the evidence, and she was going to tell them everything she knew. She put the folder in her car and drove to the police station. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to set. The streets were quiet, traffic light. At the police station, she asked to speak to a detective. She was directed to a waiting area and told that someone would be with her shortly. While she waited, Sarah thought about what she was about to do. Once she told the police about the ledger and the documents, everything would be out of her hands. The investigation would move forward without her. She would be a witness, a victim of the intrusion, but no longer in control of the situation. A detective named Marcus Chun, no relation to Robert Chun, as far as Sarah knew, came out and introduced himself. He was a tall man in his 50s, with gray hair and a calm demeanor. He led Sarah to an interview room and sat across from her at a table. I understand you have information about a break-in at your home, he said. Sarah nodded and opened the folder. She laid out the evidence, the photographs of the security video, the counterfeit knives, the ledger, the settlement documents, the letter from Morrison and Associates. She told him everything. The delivery marked as handed to the resident, even though she hadn't been home. The video showing someone opening the door from inside. The hidden compartment in the dresser. The boxes of documents in the basement. The ledger documenting transactions. The phone call to Morrison and Associates and the woman's warning. Detective Chun listened carefully, taking notes. When Sarah finished, he looked at the evidence and then back at her. This is significant, he said. You've done a good job documenting everything, but I want to make sure I understand the timeline. When did you first notice that something was wrong? Today, Sarah said, when I received the delivery notification and saw the video. And you haven't noticed any other intrusions? Any other signs that someone has been in your home? Not until I started looking more carefully. Then I found several things, moved items, open compartments, that sort of thing. But nothing was taken, nothing of value to you. No, the intruder was looking for something specific. Documents, I think, related to the previous owner. Detective Chin nodded. I'm going to need to take this evidence into custody. We'll run the counterfeit knives through forensics, see if we can identify the manufacturer. We'll also look into the ledger and see if we can identify the names and transactions. What about the person who broke in? Sarah asked. The one who opened the door for the delivery driver? That's what we need to figure out. The video shows someone opening the door, but we can't see their face or identify them from the footage. But the piece of fabric you found, that might help. If we can identify the type of fabric and the manufacturer, we might be able to trace it to a specific type of uniform or clothing. Detective Chen took the folder and stood up. I'm going to assign an officer to look into this. In the meantime, I want you to change your locks and upgrade your security system. And if you notice anything else unusual, anything at all, I want you to call me immediately. He handed her a card with his contact information. Sarah left the police station feeling both relieved and anxious. The evidence was out of her hands now. The investigation would move forward without her input. But she was still living in the house. She was still vulnerable. Over the next few days, Sarah changed her locks and upgraded her security system. She installed a new alarm system with better sensors and a backup battery. She also installed additional cameras, one in the basement, one in the bedroom, one in the kitchen. She didn't go to work. She called her boss and said she had a family emergency. She stayed home, watching the cameras, waiting for something to happen. On the fourth day, Detective Chen called her. We've made some progress, he said. The counterfeit knives came from a manufacturing facility in China. They're part of a large shipment that was intercepted by customs about 6 months ago. The shipment was supposed to be delivered to a distributor in Los Angeles, but it went missing before it reached its destination. So someone stole the counterfeit knives? Sarah asked. That's what it looks like. The shipment was valued at about $200,000 in insurance claims. Someone intercepted it and has been reselling the knives through fraudulent deliveries. Each package is insured for more than its actual value, and the insurance companies pay out the claims. How much profit are they making? Sarah asked. Based on the pattern we're seeing, somewhere between $500 and $2,000 per package. It's a low-margin operation, but if they're doing dozens of deliveries a day, it adds up quickly. Sarah thought about the implications. Dozens of deliveries a day, dozens of houses being used as drop points, dozens of people, like her, unknowingly participating in fraud. What about the ledger? She asked. Have you been able to identify the names? We're working on it. The initials are difficult to match without more context, but we've been able to cross-reference some of them with known associates of James Morrison. It looks like Morrison was facilitating the distribution network. He was using his law firm as a front to coordinate the deliveries and process the insurance claims. Is Morrison still involved? Sarah asked. Morrison is in federal prison. He pleaded guilty and is cooperating with authorities. But he's not the only person involved. There's a larger network. We're still mapping it out. What about the person who broke into my house? Sarah asked. Have you identified them? Not yet, but we're working on it. The fabric you found is consistent with the type of uniform used by several delivery and logistics companies. We're checking employment records to see if we can match it to a specific person. After Detective Chen hung up, Sarah sat in her living room and thought about what she'd learned. A network of people coordinating fraudulent deliveries, using houses like hers as drop points. Insurance companies paying out false claims. Thousands of dollars being stolen through a scheme that was simple but effective. And Robert Chen had been part of it, at least at some point. He'd been involved in settlement agreements with insurance companies, probably as part of the same fraud network. When the network had started to fall apart, when Morrison had been arrested, Robert Chen had negotiated a settlement. He'd provided documentation, probably the ledger or similar records, in exchange for immunity from prosecution. And then he'd moved away, leaving behind the evidence of his involvement. But someone else wanted that evidence. Someone who was still operating the network. Someone who was willing to break into Sarah's house to find it. Sarah realized that she was still in danger. Even though she'd given the evidence to the police, whoever had broken in didn't know that. They might try again. They might decide that Sarah herself was a threat. She thought about calling Detective Chun and asking for protection. But what would she tell him? That she was afraid of people she couldn't identify, involved in a crime she didn't fully understand? Instead, she decided to do more research. She spent hours online, searching for information about the fraud network, about James Morrison, about the insurance companies involved. She found articles about insurance fraud schemes, about networks that used multiple addresses to receive fraudulent deliveries. She found information about how insurance companies investigated claims, about the red flags they looked for. And she found something else, a pattern in the addresses used for deliveries. They were all in residential neighborhoods. They were all in houses that had been recently sold. They were all in areas where the previous owners had moved away. Sarah realized that the network was deliberately targeting houses like hers. Houses where the previous owners had left behind evidence of their involvement. Houses where the current owners might not notice unusual deliveries. Houses where the network could operate with minimal risk of detection. She thought about Robertson again. He'd been involved in the network. He'd been part of the fraud scheme. And when it had started to fall apart, he'd negotiated a settlement and moved away. But what if he hadn't moved away voluntarily? What if he'd been forced to leave? What if the network had decided that he was a liability and they'd arranged for him to disappear? Sarah searched for news about Robertson. She looked for missing person reports, for any indication that he'd vanished. But there was nothing. His LinkedIn profile showed that he was still working in Arizona. His real estate license was active. So Robertson had genuinely moved away. He was still alive, still working, still living a normal life. But he'd left behind the evidence of his involvement, and that evidence was valuable to the people still running the network. Sarah realized that she needed to understand why the ledger was so valuable. What information did it contain that was worth breaking into a house to recover? She pulled out the ledger again and examined it more carefully. The entries were coded, but some of them had notes. Small annotations that provided context. One entry, dated 4 years ago, had a note. Insurance claim approved, $45K. Another entry had a note. Documentation provided, settlement agreed. A third entry had a note. Driver arrested. Replacement needed. Sarah's breath caught. A driver arrested. That suggested that the network had experienced problems in the past. That people had been caught. That there was a history of arrests and replacements. She searched online for driver arrested insurance fraud and found several articles about delivery drivers who'd been caught participating in fraud schemes. Most of them had been charged with wire fraud and conspiracy. Most of them had faced prison time. Sarah realized that the ledger wasn't just a record of transactions. It was a record of the network's operations. It documented who had been involved, what they'd done, how much money had been made. It was a map of the entire operation, from the people who intercepted the shipments to the people who delivered the packages to the people who processed the insurance claims. And if the ledger fell into the wrong hands, into the hands of law enforcement, for example, it could bring down the entire network. That's why someone had broken into Sarah's house. That's why they'd been searching for it. That's why the woman on the phone had warned her about people who would be interested in recovering it. Sarah felt a chill run through her. She'd given the ledger to the police, which meant that the network now knew that their operation was compromised, which meant that they were probably taking steps to protect themselves. which meant that they might be trying to identify and silence anyone who could testify against them. Sarah picked up her phone and called Detective Chen. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "I think I understand why the ledger is so important. It's a complete record of the network's operations. It documents everyone involved, every transaction, every delivery. If the network knows that you have it, they'll know that their operation is compromised." "We're aware of that," Detective Chen said. "That's why we're moving quickly to identify the people named in the ledger and bring them in for questioning." "But they don't know that I gave it to you," Sarah said. "They think I still have it. They might come back." "That's a possibility," Detective Chen admitted, "which is why I'm assigning an officer to do regular patrols of your neighborhood. And I want you to be vigilant. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, I want you to call 911 immediately." After she hung up, Sarah felt slightly better, but not much. She knew that police patrols were reactive, not preventative. By the time an officer arrived, something could have already happened. She decided to take additional precautions. She installed motion sensor lights around her house. She made sure all her doors and windows were locked. She kept her phone charged and nearby at all times. Over the next week, Detective Chun called her several times with updates. The police had identified 3 people from the ledger. 2 of them had been brought in for questioning. Both had lawyered up and refused to cooperate. The third person, a man named Marcus Torres, had disappeared. His apartment was empty, his car was gone, and his phone was no longer active. "We're looking for him," Detective Chen said, "but it's possible he's already left the area." Sarah felt a sense of dread. Someone involved in the network had disappeared. That meant they were running. That meant they were afraid of being caught. That meant they might be dangerous. She thought about the person who'd broken into her house. The person who'd opened the door for the delivery driver. The person who'd been searching for the ledger. Had it been Marcus Torres? Had he been the one looking for the evidence? Sarah spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety. Every sound made her jump. Every car that drove past her house made her nervous. Every knock on the door sent her heart racing. But nothing happened. No one tried to break in. No one tried to contact her. No one tried to intimidate her. After a week of nothing, Sarah began to relax slightly. She went back to work. She resumed her normal routine. She tried to put the incident behind her, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. She couldn't stop wondering about the people involved in the network. She couldn't stop wondering about Robert Chun and what he'd been involved in. 2 weeks after she'd given the evidence to the police, Detective Chun called her again. "We've made a major breakthrough," he said. "Marcus Torres was arrested trying to cross the border into Mexico. He was carrying forged documents and a significant amount of cash. We're bringing him back for questioning." "Did he admit to breaking into my house?" Sarah asked. "Not yet, but his clothing matches the fabric you found on your window frame. We're confident he's the one who broke in." Sarah felt a sense of relief. The person who'd violated her home was going to be held accountable. The investigation was moving forward. "There's something else," Detective Chin continued. "Torres has agreed to cooperate with us in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's provided information about the network's operations, about the people involved, about the locations where they've been receiving packages." "How many locations?" Sarah asked. "At least 50, spread across 3 states. We're coordinating with federal authorities to investigate all of them." Sarah realized the scope of the operation. 50 locations, dozens of people involved, thousands of fraudulent deliveries, millions of dollars in insurance fraud. "What about the person who called me?" Sarah asked. "The woman from Morrison and Associates?" "We're still trying to identify her, but based on Torres's information, we believe she's a key member of the network. She's the one who coordinates the deliveries and processes the insurance claims. If we can find her, we can probably bring down the entire operation. Over the next month, the investigation expanded. Federal authorities became involved. Multiple arrests were made. More people were brought in for questioning. And slowly, the network began to unravel. Sarah followed the news coverage of the investigation. She read articles about the arrests, about the charges being filed, about the scope of the fraud operation. She watched as the people involved in the network were identified and prosecuted. But the woman who'd called her, the one who'd warned her about people being interested in recovering the ledger, was never identified. Detective Chun told Sarah that they suspected she'd fled the country, but they had no way to confirm it. 3 months after the initial break-in, Detective Chin called Sarah with a final update. "The investigation is essentially complete," he said. "We've identified and arrested 23 people involved in the network. We've recovered approximately $400,000 in fraudulent insurance claims. And we've shut down the operation." "What about Robert Chun?" Sarah asked. "Is he being prosecuted?" "No. He cooperated with authorities 3 years ago when he settled with Morrison and Associates. He provided the ledger and the documentation that helped us understand the scope of the operation. In exchange, he was given immunity from prosecution. He's living in Arizona, and as far as we know, he's not involved in any illegal activity." Sarah felt a sense of closure. The investigation was over. The network had been dismantled. The people involved were being held accountable. But she also felt a lingering sense of unease. She'd been caught up in something that had nothing to do with her. She'd been a victim of a crime that had been committed by people she'd never met, for reasons she didn't fully understand. She thought about Robert Chun, living his life in Arizona, free from prosecution because he'd cooperated with authorities. She thought about the network, operating for years without detection, stealing millions of dollars through a simple but effective scheme. She thought about the woman who'd called her, the one who'd warned her about people being interested in the ledger. That woman was still out there, somewhere. She'd escaped prosecution. She'd disappeared. Sarah realized that the investigation had answered most of her questions, but not all of them. She would probably never know the full extent of what Robert Shin had been involved in. She would probably never understand the complete network of people and transactions documented in the ledger. But she did know one thing. She knew that her house had been a target. She knew that someone had broken in looking for evidence. She knew that she'd been part of something larger than herself, something that had implications far beyond her own life. And she knew that she'd done the right thing by going to the police, by turning over the evidence, by cooperating with the investigation. Sarah changed her locks again, just to be sure. She kept her upgraded security system in place. She continued to be vigilant about her home security. But gradually, over the following months, life returned to normal. The initial shock of the intrusion faded. The fear of being targeted by the network diminished. The anxiety about unknown threats lessened. Sarah settled back into her routine. She went to work, came home, spent her evenings reading or watching television. She maintained her house, paid her bills, lived her life. But every time she received a delivery, she thought about that day when a package had been marked as handed to the resident, even though she hadn't been home. Every time she locked her door, she thought about the person who'd opened it from the inside. Every time she looked at her bedroom window, she thought about the piece of blue fabric caught on the frame. The physical evidence of the crime had been removed. The investigation had been closed. The people involved had been arrested and prosecuted. But the memory remained. The knowledge that her home had been violated. The understanding that she'd been caught up in something dangerous and illegal. The awareness that the world contained networks of crime and fraud that operated invisibly, using ordinary people and ordinary houses to facilitate their activities. One evening, 6 months after the break-in, Sarah received an unexpected package. It was from the delivery company, a formal letter from their corporate office. The letter stated that the company had conducted an internal investigation into the fraudulent delivery that had been sent to her address. The investigation had confirmed that one of their drivers had been involved in the fraud scheme without the company's knowledge or authorization. The company was offering Sarah a settlement of $5,000 as compensation for the intrusion into her home and the violation of her privacy. They were also offering her a year of free shipping on any purchases she made through their service. Sarah read the letter carefully. $5,000. It was a significant amount, but it felt insufficient. How could you compensate someone for the violation of their home? How could you put a price on the sense of security that had been taken away? She decided to donate the money to a victim advocacy organization. She didn't feel right keeping it. She didn't feel like a victim, exactly. She'd been inconvenienced, violated, but she hadn't been harmed. Others had been harmed. The insurance companies that had been defrauded, the people whose identities had been used to process claims, the delivery drivers who'd been caught up in the scheme. Sarah put the letter aside and tried not to think about it anymore. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would sometimes think about the woman who'd called her. The woman who'd warned her about people being interested in the ledger. That woman had been intelligent, organized, careful. She'd coordinated a network of fraud that had operated for years without detection. She'd managed people, processes, and transactions with precision and efficiency. And she'd escaped. She was still out there, somewhere, probably running another operation, probably coordinating another network of fraud. Sarah wondered if she would ever be caught. She wondered if the investigation had truly been complete, or if it had only scratched the surface of a much larger operation. She wondered about the ledger, sitting in a police evidence locker somewhere, documenting transactions and relationships that had been partially uncovered but never fully understood. And she wondered about Robert Chun, living his life in Arizona, free from prosecution because he'd cooperated with authorities, but carrying the knowledge of what he'd been involved in, the guilt of his participation in a fraud scheme that had stolen millions of dollars. Sarah realized that these were questions she would probably never have answers to. The investigation had closed. The case had been filed away. The people involved had been processed through the criminal justice system. But the underlying reality remained. Crime was real. Fraud was real. Networks of illegal activity existed in the spaces between ordinary people and ordinary transactions. And sometimes, by chance or circumstance, ordinary people like Sarah got caught up in those networks. They became witnesses, victims, participants in investigations that revealed the darker aspects of human nature and human society. Sarah accepted this knowledge. She accepted that she would never fully understand what had happened or why. She accepted that there would always be loose ends, unanswered questions, mysteries that would remain unsolved. And she moved forward with her life, carrying the memory of those few days when her home had been violated, when her sense of security had been shattered, when she discovered that the world was more complex and dangerous than she'd realized. She locked her doors. She armed her security system. She remained vigilant. But she also lived. She worked. She spent time with friends. She pursued her interests and her goals. She didn't let the fear of what had happened prevent her from living her life. Because that was the real victory, she realized. Not in solving the crime or catching the criminals, but in moving forward despite the violation, in rebuilding her sense of security, in choosing to live rather than to hide. Sarah stood at her kitchen window one evening, looking out at her backyard. The fence was intact. The gate was locked. The flowers in the garden were beginning to bloom. Everything was as it should be. Everything was safe and secure and normal. But she knew that beneath the surface of ordinary life, there were networks of crime and fraud. There were people committing illegal acts, stealing money, violating the trust and security of others. And she knew that she'd been lucky. Lucky that the crime had been discovered. Lucky that the person who'd broken in had been caught. Lucky that she'd been able to cooperate with authorities and help bring down the network. Not everyone was so lucky. Not everyone had the opportunity to help solve the crime or see justice served. Sarah closed her curtains and went inside. She locked the door behind her and armed the security system. Outside, the night was dark and quiet. Inside, Sarah was safe. The crime had been solved. The network had been dismantled. Justice had been served. And life, in all its ordinary complexity, continued on. Case 3. A man reviewing his utility bill noticed an unusual spike during the night. The increase wasn't extreme, just enough to stand out. He had been out of the house the entire time. He stared at the bill for the third time that morning, sitting at his kitchen table with cold coffee beside him. The numbers didn't change. His usage had spiked between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. on a Wednesday night, the night he'd driven to his sister's place 2 hours away and stayed until Thursday afternoon. The increase was roughly 12 kilowatt hours. Not catastrophic. Easy to dismiss as a billing error or a meter malfunction. But he'd been meticulous about his energy consumption for years. He knew his baseline. Winter heating ran him about 35 kilowatt hours on a cold day. Summer air conditioning, maybe 28. A single night jump of 12 kilowatt hours was unusual enough to nag at him. He pulled up his account history on his phone. 6 months of data. His consumption was remarkably consistent. A gentle wave that peaked in December and dipped in April. This spike in March stood alone, a small mountain on an otherwise flat landscape. He decided to walk through the house. The living room was exactly as he'd left it. Couch, television, the bookshelf he'd been meaning to reorganize. He touched the TV screen. Cool. He checked the outlet behind the entertainment center. Nothing plugged in except the TV itself, which he always powered down completely before leaving. He did it out of habit, a childhood lesson from his father about phantom loads. The kitchen offered nothing unusual. Refrigerator humming its normal hum. Microwave unplugged. The electric range hadn't been used in days. He'd eaten takeout before the drive to his sister's. Upstairs, his bedroom was undisturbed. Bed made. Closet organized. The thermostat on the wall read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He kept it set to that temperature year-round, letting the house breathe naturally during mild months. He checked the setting. Still at 68. The digital display showed no signs of tampering. But then he noticed something small. The air filter in the hallway closet. He pulled it out. It was caked with dust and pet hair. His cat, Luna, shed constantly. The filter looked like it hadn't been changed in months, which was true. He'd been lazy about maintenance. He held it up to the light from the hallway window. The dust was thick, matted down. But there was a clean section along one edge, about 2 inches wide, where the dust pattern had been disturbed. Not dramatically, just noticeably different from the rest of the filter's surface. He frowned. He'd touched the filter himself just now, but only at the edges. This clean section was in the middle of the filter's face, as if someone had pressed their palm against it. He set the filter down carefully on the hallway floor and continued his inspection. The basement was cool and dim. His water heater sat in the corner, a 10-year-old model that still worked reliably. He placed his hand against its metal surface. Warm, but not hot. Normal. He checked the electrical panel. All breakers were in the proper position. Nothing tripped, nothing unusual. Back upstairs, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table again. The utility bill sat in front of him. He pulled out his phone and opened the utility company's app, looking for more detailed information. The spike had occurred in the early morning hours, 11:47 p.m. to 3:22 a.m. That was a 4-hour, 35-minute window. He thought about what could consume that much power. A space heater running continuously would do it. A window air conditioning unit in heating mode, though that seemed unlikely in March. A clothes dryer, but he had a gas dryer, not electric. The oven? Possible, but why would anyone use his oven for 4.5 hours while he was gone? His mind moved to the obvious answer. Someone had been in his house. He didn't feel a spike of fear. Instead, he felt a kind of methodical curiosity, the same sensation he got when reading mystery novels. He was trying to fit pieces together to see if they formed a coherent picture. He went back to the basement and looked more carefully at the water heater. The electrical cord ran from the breaker panel to the unit. He traced it with his eyes, following it along the concrete floor and up the side of the heater. The cord looked normal. No damage, no signs of being unplugged and replugged. But there was something else. A faint mark on the concrete floor, about 3 feet from the water heater. It looked like a scuff mark, the kind you'd make if you were dragging something heavy across the floor. The concrete was dusty and undisturbed in most places, but this mark was fresh. The dust had been wiped away in a thin line, revealing the gray concrete beneath. He knelt down and examined it more closely. The mark was roughly 3 feet long and 6 inches wide. Whatever had been dragged was rectangular and substantial. He looked around the basement for anything out of place. Nothing seemed to be missing or moved. But something had been here, on this floor, recently. He stood and moved toward the far corner of the basement, where he kept old boxes of documents and a filing cabinet. The filing cabinet was locked, and the key was upstairs in his bedroom desk. He didn't remember opening it recently. He climbed the stairs and retrieved the key. Back in the basement, he unlocked the cabinet and pulled out the drawers. Tax returns, insurance documents, mortgage paperwork. Everything appeared to be in order. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed or removed. He locked the cabinet again and returned the key to its place. The dragging mark bothered him. He studied it again, trying to determine what direction the object had been moving. The mark seemed to go from the corner of the basement toward the center of the room, toward the water heater area. He went upstairs and called his utility company's customer service line. After navigating the automated system, he reached a representative. "I'm calling about an unusual spike in my electricity usage," he said. "On March 12th, between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. The representative pulled up his account. "Yes, I see that. 12.3 kilowatt hours during that period. That's definitely higher than your normal usage." "I wasn't home that night," he said. "I was out of the house the entire time." There was a pause. "Have you checked your heating system?" Sometimes thermostats can malfunction and cause the heating to run continuously. The thermostat is set to 68 degrees. It hasn't been adjusted. It's possible the heating kicked on due to a temperature drop. Do you have a programmable thermostat? No, just a basic mechanical one. In that case, I'd recommend having an electrician inspect your home. There could be a faulty appliance or a wiring issue that's causing the excess consumption. We can also send someone out to verify your meter if you'd like. He declined the meter verification but thanked the representative. He hung up and sat in silence. The dragging mark, the disturbed air filter, the absence of any obvious appliance running. He went to his bedroom and opened the desk drawer where he kept his keys. His house key, his car key, his mailbox key. He'd never given anyone a spare. His sister had one, but she lived 2 hours away and had no reason to visit while he was gone. He thought about the front door. It was locked when he returned from his sister's house. He remembered turning the key and pushing it open. The deadbolt had been engaged. He was certain of that because he always locked it when he left, unless someone had locked it from the inside after letting themselves in. He went downstairs and examined the front door. The deadbolt was solid, the door frame intact. No signs of forced entry. No scratches around the lock. No splintered wood. He checked the back door in the kitchen. Same story. Locked, undamaged, no evidence of a break-in. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the utility bill again. The numbers were real. The spike had happened, and if no one had broken in, then someone had used a key. His sister, his neighbor who sometimes watered his plants, the plumber who'd come out last year to fix a leak, the previous owner of the house, though that seemed far-fetched. He'd owned the property for 6 years. He pulled out his phone and texted his sister. "Did you stop by the house on Wednesday night while I was coming to your place?" The response came quickly. "No, why?" He didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the dragging mark in the basement, about the disturbed air filter, about 4.5 hours of electricity being consumed while his house was empty and locked. He went to the basement again and looked at the mark on the floor. It was definitely fresh. The dust around it had settled naturally, but the mark itself showed no dust accumulation. It had been made recently, within the last few days, certainly, possibly the night of the spike. He followed the mark with his eyes, tracing its direction. It started near the filing cabinet and moved toward the center of the basement, toward the water heater, toward the electrical panel. He looked at the electrical panel again. All the breakers were in the normal position, but he pulled out his phone and took a photo of the panel, making a note of the date. If he needed to compare it later, if something had been moved and then moved back, he'd have a record. Back upstairs, he sat at the kitchen table and made a list. Unusual spike, 12.3 kilowatt hours between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. on March 12th. Duration, 4 hours 35 minutes. House was locked when he returned. No signs of forced entry. Air filter had a clean palm print section. Basement floor had a fresh dragging mark. Dragging mark appeared to go from filing cabinet area toward water heater. He stared at the list. It was circumstantial. Any one of these items alone could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern. Someone had been in his house. Someone had access to a key. Someone had been looking for something or doing something that consumed a significant amount of electricity. He thought about the filing cabinet, his tax returns, his mortgage documents, his insurance information. Nothing had been taken, as far as he could tell. But had someone been looking through it? Had they found what they were looking for? He pulled out the filing cabinet again and examined the documents more carefully. They were in the same order as he remembered, but he couldn't be certain. He'd never cataloged them precisely. It was possible someone had gone through them and then returned them to their approximate original positions. He closed the cabinet and locked it again. The dragging mark. Whatever had been moved was heavy enough to scuff concrete. Not a briefcase. Not a laptop. Something substantial. Something that required effort to move. He went back to the basement and looked at the water heater again. It was a standard electric unit, maybe 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide. Could someone have been trying to move it? But why? And the mark didn't seem to indicate that the water heater itself had been moved. The mark was separate from it, a few feet away, unless someone had moved something else. Something that had been stored near the water heater. Something that didn't belong there. He looked around the basement more carefully. In the corner near the water heater, there was a stack of old boxes. He'd been meaning to sort through them for years, mostly old textbooks from college, some kitchen items he'd replaced, some decorations he no longer used. The boxes were dusty, undisturbed as far as he could tell, but he pulled them away from the wall anyway, creating a gap. The concrete behind them was noticeably cleaner than the surrounding floor, suggesting the boxes had been moved recently. Not by much, just enough to create a small space behind them. He knelt down and peered into the gap. Nothing there now, just concrete and dust. But something had been stored there, something that had been removed. He sat back on his heels, thinking. Someone had been in his house. They'd used an electrical appliance for 4.5 hours. They'd moved something heavy from behind the boxes near the water heater. They'd possibly looked through his filing cabinet. And then they'd left, locking the door behind them. The question was, what had they been doing? He thought about the electrical consumption again. 12.3 kilowatt hours. What appliance could run for 4.5 hours and consume that much power? A space heater, certainly. A dehumidifier, maybe. An air compressor. A power tool of some kind. A power tool. The thought stuck with him. Why would someone be using power tools in his basement? He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Everything appeared intact. No holes, no damage, no evidence of construction or demolition. But if someone had been using power tools, a drill, a saw, a grinder, they would have been careful to hide the evidence. Unless they hadn't been trying to hide it. Unless they'd simply been doing something quickly and efficiently, knowing they had a limited window of time before he returned. He went upstairs and called his sister again. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Have you given anyone else a key to my house? Anyone at all?" "No," she said. "Why? Is something wrong?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm going to have the locks changed." He hung up and made a call to a local locksmith. They could come out the next morning. He booked an appointment. That night, he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the dragging mark, the air filter, the missing object from behind the boxes. He thought about who might have access to his house, who might want to do something in his basement for 4.5 hours. He thought about the previous owners of the house, about contractors who'd worked there, about anyone who might have kept the key, and he thought about the object that had been moved. What had it been? Why had it been there? Where had it gone? The next morning, the locksmith arrived and changed all the locks. As the man was leaving, he paused at the front door. "You know," the locksmith said, "if someone had a key before, they might have made a copy. Changing the locks is a good precaution, but you might want to consider a security system too, especially if you're going to be away from home." He nodded and thanked the man. After the locksmith left, he stood in his house and felt a strange sense of violation. Someone had been here. Someone had moved through his rooms, had used his electricity, had looked through his things, and he still didn't know who or why. He went back to the basement one more time. The dragging mark was still visible on the floor, a physical reminder of the intrusion. He took another photo of it, documenting the date and time. Then he sat at his kitchen table and stared at the utility bill. The numbers were real. The spike had happened, and somewhere out there, someone knew what had occurred in his basement during those 4.5 hours on the night of March 12th. He just had to figure out what it was. He spent the next 3 days waiting. The locksmith's work was done, but the unease lingered. He kept the utility bill on his kitchen counter, a physical anchor to the question that wouldn't leave him alone. On the 4th day, he decided to examine his house with more precision. Not a casual walkthrough, but a systematic inspection. He started with the basement again, this time with a notebook and a flashlight, even though daylight came through the small basement windows. The dragging mark on the concrete was still visible. He measured it with a tape measure from his garage, 3 feet 2 inches long, 7 inches wide. He drew a diagram in his notebook, marking its location relative to the water heater and the filing cabinet. Then he looked at the boxes again. He pulled them all away from the wall and examined the space behind them. The concrete was definitely cleaner here, a rectangular patch about 4 feet by 3 feet. Whatever had been stored there had been substantial and had stayed for a while, long enough for dust to settle around it, but not on top of it. He moved the boxes back to their original position, trying to match them to the dust patterns on the concrete. When he was done, he stepped back. The boxes looked natural now, as if they'd never been moved. But he knew they had been. He climbed the basement stairs and went to the main floor. In the kitchen, he opened the junk drawer where he kept old receipts and paperwork. He was looking for anything related to the house, contractor information, warranty documents, anything that might give him a clue about who had worked here or who might have access. He found a folder labeled House Documents in the drawer. Inside were receipts from various repairs and maintenance jobs. He flipped through them. A plumber from 2023, an electrician from 2022, a roofer from 2021. He made note of each name and business. Then he found something else. A receipt from a company called Precision Home Inspection, dated from 6 years ago, just before he'd bought the house. That was the home inspector's report from his purchase. He set that aside. But there was another receipt, this one from a company called Advanced Security Solutions, dated from 4 years ago. It was for an estimate on a home security system. The estimate had never been accepted. He'd decided against installing a system at the time, thinking it was unnecessary for a quiet neighborhood. He looked at the receipt more carefully. It was from a technician named Marcus Webb. The company's phone number was listed at the top. He pulled out his phone and searched for the company online. The website came up. Advanced Security Solutions was still in business, located about 15 minutes away. He scrolled through their portfolio of residential installations. They offered standard security systems, door and window sensors, motion detectors, security cameras. Nothing unusual. He called the number on the receipt. A woman answered. Advanced Security Solutions, this is Jennifer speaking. How can I help you? I have an old estimate from your company, he said, from about 4 years ago. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about the technician who did the estimate. Of course. What's the name on the estimate? Marcus Webb. There was a pause. He heard typing in the background. Marcus Webb is no longer with us, Jennifer said. He left the company about 3 years ago. Is there something I can help you with regarding your estimate? Actually, I'm not sure. I'm just trying to track down some information about past work on my house. Do you have any record of what Marcus discussed during his visit? I can look that up. What's your address? He gave her the address. More typing. Then Jennifer's voice came back, slightly uncertain. That's odd. I'm looking at the file, and there's a note that says Marcus visited the property, but no estimate was generated. The note says customer declined further service. That's all we have. He thanked her and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table, turning this over in his mind. Marcus Webb had visited his house 4 years ago, but never generated an estimate. That was unusual. Most home security companies would have at least left a written proposal. He searched online for Marcus Webb and Advanced Security Solutions. Nothing came up. He tried searching for Marcus Webb alone. Several results appeared, but none of them seemed to match a security system technician. Most were unrelated people with the same name. He went back to his house documents. He pulled out the home inspection report from his original purchase. The inspector's name was David Chun from Reliable Home Inspections. That was 6 years ago. He searched for the company online. The website was still active, though it looked dated. He called the number. A man answered. Reliable Home Inspections, this is David Chun. Hi, David. I purchased my house 6 years ago, and you performed the home inspection. I was wondering if you had any notes about the property, specifically about the basement and any electrical systems. I'd be happy to help, David said. What's the address? He provided it. David said he'd look through his files and call back if he could find anything. 2 hours later, David called back. I found your inspection report, David said. I have notes here from the basement. The electrical panel was in good condition at the time. The water heater was relatively new, about 4 years old at that point, so it would be about 10 years old now. I noted that there was adequate space for storage, but recommended against blocking access to the electrical panel or water heater. Did you notice anything unusual in the basement? He asked. Anything that stood out? Not that I noted in the report. Why do you ask? Just trying to understand the history of the house. After hanging up, he sat in the basement again, looking at the space behind the boxes. 10 years old. The water heater was now 10 years old. That seemed significant somehow, but he wasn't sure why. He went upstairs and looked up the manufacturer information on the water heater. It was a standard electric model, rated for about 10 to 12 years of use. If it was 10 years old now, it was nearing the end of its lifespan. It might need replacing soon, but that didn't explain the dragging mark. That didn't explain the 4.5 hours of electricity consumption. He decided to check his property records. He went online and pulled up the deed to his house. The previous owner was listed as Patricia and Robert Morrison. They'd owned the house for 8 years before he bought it. The owners before them were listed as James and Helen Garrett, who'd owned it for 12 years. He searched for information about the Morrisons. Nothing came up except a few Facebook profiles that didn't seem to match. He tried searching for the Garretts. Again, nothing specific. But then he tried a different approach. He searched for property records in his county from around the time the Garretts had owned the house. He found a listing from a local news archive about a home invasion in the area, dated from about 15 years ago. It wasn't his address, but it was the same neighborhood. He read the article. A family had been robbed while away on vacation. The thieves had apparently had a key to the house. There were no signs of forced entry. The article didn't provide many details, but it mentioned that the police suspected it was an inside job, possibly involving someone who'd worked on the property. He closed the article and sat back. This was probably unrelated to his situation, but it made him think. If someone had access to a key, they could return to the house at any time. They could do things when the owner was away. They could consume electricity for 4.5 hours and then leave, locking the door behind them. He went back to his list of contractors. The plumber from 2023, the electrician from 2022, the roofer from 2021. He called the plumber's number first. A man answered. "This is Tom's Plumbing." "Hi, Tom. I'm calling about some work you did at my house about 3 years ago. I'm just trying to verify some information. What's your address?" He provided it. Tom said he'd check his records. "Yeah, I remember that job," Tom said when he came back. "It was a water line repair. Took about 2 hours. Why do you ask?" "Just doing some verification." "Did you work in the basement at all?" "No, the water line issue was in the main floor bathroom. Didn't need to go to the basement." He thanked Tom and hung up. He called the electrician next. "Henderson Electric," a woman answered. "Hi, I'm calling about some work done at my house about 4 years ago. An electrician came out to do some work. Do you have an invoice number?" He looked back at his receipt. "No, I just have the date. It was in 2022. I'll need more information to look that up." "What was the work?" "I'm not entirely sure. That's why I'm calling." "I'm sorry, but I can't help you without more details. Do you have an invoice or receipt?" He looked at the receipt again. It just said electrical service call with a date and a cost. No description of what was done. "The receipt doesn't give details about what was actually done," he said. "Then I'm not sure how I can help." If you need work done, I'd recommend calling for an estimate." He hung up. That was frustrating. The receipt was vague, just a charge for a service call with no description of what service was provided. He pulled out his bank statements from 2022 and looked at the transaction. The charge was from Henderson Electric for $187.50. That seemed like a reasonable amount for a service call, but it didn't tell him what had been done. He decided to call the roofer. The receipt was from 2021, and the company was listed as Midwest Roofing. A man answered. "Midwest Roofing, this is Jim." "Hi, Jim. I'm calling about some roof work done at my house in 2021. I'm trying to verify some information about the job. What's the address?" He provided it. Jim said he'd look it up. "Yeah, I remember that one," Jim said. "We replaced some damaged shingles on the north side of the roof. Storm damage from a hail event. Took about half a day." "Why do you ask?" "Just verifying. Did anyone go into the house during that work?" "No, we stayed on the roof. Didn't need to go inside." He thanked Jim and hung up. So the roofer hadn't been inside. The plumber hadn't been in the basement. The electrician's work was mysterious. He had no record of what had actually been done. He went back to his junk drawer and looked through the receipts again. He was looking for anything related to the basement or the electrical system. He found another receipt, this one from 2023, from a company called Basement Solutions Plus. The receipt was for an estimate on waterproofing and foundation repair. He called the number. A woman answered and said the company had gone out of business about a year ago. She was apparently answering a forwarded line. He searched online for Basement Solutions Plus and found a few old reviews on Google. Most were neutral or positive, but one stood out. A customer had written, "They came out for an estimate, but were very interested in the electrical panel in my basement. Asked a lot of questions about access and whether I had a security system. Felt a bit odd about it, so I didn't hire them." The review was dated from 2023, the same year he'd gotten the estimate. But it wasn't from his address, it was from someone else in the area. He sat back in his chair. This was getting more complex. A company that had asked unusual questions about electrical panels and security systems. A company that was now out of business. An electrician whose work was never documented. An air filter with a palm print. A dragging mark on the basement floor. An object that had been removed from behind the boxes. He pulled out his phone and called the non-emergency police line. "I'd like to report a possible break-in," he said when an officer answered. "Nothing was stolen as far as I can tell, but I believe someone was in my house while I was away." The officer took down his information and said someone would contact him to file a report. An hour later, a police officer named Detective Sarah Martinez called back. She asked him to describe what had happened. He walked her through the utility spike, the air filter, the dragging mark, the boxes that had been moved. He explained that he'd had the locks changed and that he had no record of who might have accessed the house. "Have you noticed anything missing?" Detective Martinez asked. "Not that I can tell. I've looked through the house several times." "Any signs of forced entry?" "No. The doors and windows are all intact. So someone used a key to get in." "That's what it appears to be. Do you know who might have a key?" "Family, friends, contractors. My sister has a key, but she denied visiting. I've had several contractors work on the house over the years, but none of them should have needed access to the basement for their specific jobs." "I'd like to come out and take a look," Detective Martinez said. "Can you be home tomorrow morning?" "Yes, I can." The next morning, Detective Martinez arrived with a notebook and a camera. She was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner. She walked through the house, taking photos and notes. In the basement, she examined the dragging mark and the space behind the boxes. She photographed both areas from multiple angles. "This is interesting," she said, kneeling down to look at the mark more closely. "Do you know what might have made this?" "No. Something heavy, I think. Something that was moved from behind those boxes." She stood up and looked around the basement. Her eyes landed on the electrical panel. "Has anyone worked on your electrical system recently? There's a receipt from 2022 for an electrical service call, but I don't have details about what was done. Do you remember the technician's name?" He pulled out the receipt. "Just says Henderson Electric. The company is still in business." Detective Martinez made a note. "I'm going to contact them and see if they have records of the work. In the meantime, I want you to think about whether anything seems out of place, even small things. Sometimes people go through houses looking for valuables, and they don't always put things back exactly as they found them." After Detective Martinez left, he spent the rest of the day going through his house with meticulous attention. He opened every drawer, every cabinet, every closet. He looked at his jewelry box. Nothing seemed to be missing. His laptop was still there. His television, his stereo equipment, his tools. Nothing of obvious value appeared to be gone. But in his bedroom closet, he noticed something. A shelf where he kept some old photo albums. The albums were in a stack, and he was fairly certain they'd been in a different order the last time he'd looked. He pulled them out and examined them. They were just old family photos, nothing valuable. But someone had definitely moved them. The dust pattern on the shelf showed where they'd been sitting, and the current arrangement didn't match that pattern. He went downstairs and called Detective Martinez. "I found something," he said. "Someone went through my bedroom closet. They moved some photo albums. Did anything go missing?" "Not that I can tell. They're just old family photos." "That's interesting. If someone broke in, they usually take valuables. Photo albums aren't typically high-value items. Unless they weren't looking for valuables," he said. "Unless they were looking for something specific." There was a pause on the line. "What do you mean?" Detective Martinez asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I have a feeling this isn't a random burglary." After he hung up, he sat in his bedroom and thought about the photo albums. Why would someone go through old family photos? What would they be looking for? He pulled the albums out again and looked through them. Most were from his childhood and college years. Some were from family vacations. Nothing seemed unusual or significant. But as he flipped through one album, he noticed something. A few pages had been removed. The binding showed small tears where photos had been cut out or pulled away. He looked more carefully at the other albums. In the second album, more pages were damaged. In the third album, several photos were missing from the middle section. He examined the damage more closely. It looked deliberate. Someone had carefully removed specific photos from the albums, trying not to damage the binding too much. The missing photos were scattered throughout the albums, not just from one time period or one location. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Martinez again. "The photo albums," he said. "Someone removed photos from them. They were careful about it, but you can see where pages have been torn out." "What kind of photos were removed?" Detective Martinez asked. "I'm not sure. I need to look through them more carefully." He spent the next 2 hours examining the albums and trying to figure out which photos were missing. It was difficult because he didn't have a complete memory of what had been in the albums originally. But he could see the gaps where photos had been. He noticed a pattern. The removed photos seemed to be from a specific time period, roughly 15 to 20 years ago, and they seemed to focus on certain locations. He could see the edges of photos showing what looked like his house's exterior, his basement, his backyard, but the photos themselves were gone. He called Detective Martinez one more time. "I think I know what they were looking for," he said. "Someone removed photos of my house from my albums. Specifically, photos from about 15 to 20 years ago." Why would someone want old photos of your house? I don't know, but it seems like they were looking for something specific, something they thought might be documented in those photos. Detective Martinez said she'd come back out to look at the albums. In the meantime, she said she'd contact the previous owners of the house to see if they'd had any unusual incidents. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the missing photos. What could someone want with pictures of his house from 15 to 20 years ago? What could be so important that they would break in, use electricity for 4.5 hours, move something heavy from the basement, and then carefully remove photos from his albums? The answer had to be connected to the basement, to the space behind the boxes, to whatever had been stored there and then removed. He went downstairs and opened his laptop. He searched for news articles about his neighborhood from 15 to 20 years ago. He found several articles about crime in the area, but nothing that stood out as obviously connected to his house. Then he searched for home invasion in his neighborhood. He found the article he'd seen before about the family that had been robbed while away on vacation. But he also found another article from about 18 years ago about a theft at a local business. The article mentioned that the thieves had used equipment and knowledge that suggested an inside job. The business owner had suspected that someone who'd worked on the property had provided access or information to the article about the business theft mentioned a name, Marcus Webb. He was listed as a person of interest in the investigation, though no charges had ever been filed. The article was vague about the details, but it mentioned that Webb had worked as a contractor at the business before the theft occurred. He sat back in his chair. Marcus Webb, the same name as the security system technician who'd visited his house 4 years ago. He searched for more information about Marcus Webb and the business theft. The articles were sparse, local news coverage from nearly 2 decades ago, but he found enough to piece together a basic timeline. A business called Midwest Electronics Supply had been robbed of approximately $50,000 in equipment and components. The theft occurred over several weeks, with items being removed gradually. Marcus Webb had worked there as a maintenance contractor and had access to the building after hours. Webb had been questioned by police, but was never charged. The article suggested that the investigation had stalled due to lack of evidence. Webb had apparently left the area shortly after the investigation ended. He pulled up the property records for his house again. The previous owners were Patricia and Robert Morrison. Before them were James and Helen Garrett. He searched for information about the Garretts and the Morrisons, looking for any connection to Marcus Webb or the business theft. Nothing obvious came up, but then he tried a different search. He looked for property records from around the time of the Midwest Electronics theft 18 years ago. He found that the Garretts had purchased the house about 19 years ago, just before the theft occurred. He searched for James Garrett online. Nothing came up except for a few old Facebook profiles and a LinkedIn page that hadn't been updated in years. But then he searched for James Garrett and Midwest Electronics. One result appeared, a court document from 18 years ago. The document was a civil lawsuit. Midwest Electronics Supply had sued James Garrett for $50,000, claiming that he had conspired with an employee to steal equipment and components from the business. The lawsuit had been settled out of court, with Garrett agreeing to pay a portion of the damages. He read the document several times. James Garrett had owned the house. Marcus Webb had worked at the business where the theft occurred, and somehow they were connected. He searched for more information about the settlement. The court records were limited, but he found a mention in a local newspaper article about business litigation. The article stated that the case had been settled confidentially, with terms not disclosed to the public. But the article also mentioned something else. It said that the stolen equipment had never been recovered. Police suspected that the equipment had been hidden somewhere, and that the conspirators had planned to sell it later, after the investigation cooled down. He sat back and thought about this. The stolen equipment had never been recovered. It had been hidden somewhere. And 18 years later, someone had broken into his house, spent 4.5 hours using electricity, moved something heavy from the basement, and removed photos of the house from old albums. The basement, the space behind the boxes, the dragging mark on the concrete. He went downstairs and looked at the basement again. The boxes were still in their original position. He pulled them away and examined the concrete behind them. The clean patch was still visible. He thought about the size of the patch. 4 feet by 3 feet. Large enough to store equipment. Large enough to hide stolen electronics. But if the equipment had been hidden there 18 years ago, why would someone come back now to retrieve it? Unless they'd just discovered where it was. Unless they'd finally figured out that James Garrett had hidden it in the basement of his house. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Martinez. "I think I've figured out what this is about," he said. "The person who broke in was looking for stolen equipment that was hidden in my basement about 18 years ago." He explained what he'd found, the connection between Marcus Webb, James Garrett, and the Midwest electronics theft. He told her about the lawsuit, the hidden equipment, and the missing photos. The person who broke in was probably looking for photos that showed where the equipment was hidden, he said. They wanted to remove any evidence that could help locate it. Detective Martinez listened carefully. When he finished, she said, "That's a plausible theory, but it's also complicated. Let me do some investigating on my end. I'll contact the police department that handled the original theft case and see what they have in their files." Over the next few days, Detective Martinez called him with updates. She'd found the original case file from the Midwest electronics theft. The investigation had indeed stalled, and Marcus Webb had never been charged. But the detective who'd handled the case, now retired, remembered that they'd suspected Webb had an accomplice, someone on the inside at Midwest Electronics. That accomplice was James Garrett. Garrett had been the owner of Midwest Electronics at the time. He'd hired Webb to do maintenance work, and they'd apparently conspired to steal equipment and hide it. When the theft was discovered, Garrett had settled the lawsuit and quietly sold his business. "The question is," Detective Martinez said, "why would someone break into your house now, 18 years later, looking for equipment that was supposedly hidden there?" "Because someone just found out where it was," he said. "Someone who has a stake in recovering it." He thought about this. Who would have a stake in recovering stolen equipment from 18 years ago? Possibly Marcus Webb, if he'd never received his share of the proceeds. Possibly someone connected to Webb or Garrett who wanted the equipment for themselves. He searched online for more recent information about Marcus Webb. He found a few references in business directories from the 2010s, listing him as an employee of Advanced Security Solutions. But nothing more recent than that. He searched for Marcus Webb and Advanced Security Solutions together. He found a few old reviews of the company online, but nothing that mentioned Webb specifically. Then he searched for Advanced Security Solutions in the news. He found an article from about 3 years ago. The company had been investigated by the State Attorney General's office for fraud. The investigation had found that the company had been running a scheme where they would visit homes under the pretense of providing security estimates, but they were actually casing the properties for burglary. Several employees had been arrested, but the article didn't list their names. He called Detective Martinez and told her about the article. "That's very helpful," she said. "Let me contact the Attorney General's office and see if Marcus Webb was one of the employees involved in that scheme." 2 days later, Detective Martinez called back. Marcus Webb was indeed involved in the fraud scheme, she said. He was arrested 3 years ago and served 18 months in prison. He was released about a year ago. So he's out of prison, he said. And he came back here looking for the stolen equipment. That's the most likely scenario, Detective Martinez said. Webb probably knew about the equipment that was hidden in your house. He may have been looking for it all these years, but he didn't have access until recently. When he got out of prison, he probably decided to try to find it. But how did he get a key to my house? That's what we need to figure out. Let me contact the previous owners and see if they had any connection to Webb. Detective Martinez called back a few hours later. I spoke with Patricia Morrison, she said. She and her husband owned the house before you. She said that about 5 years ago, they hired a contractor to do some electrical work in the basement. The contractor's name was Marcus Webb. There it was. The connection. Webb had worked as a contractor on the house. He'd had access to the basement. He'd likely made a copy of the key during his visit. 5 years ago, he said. That would have been before he was arrested. Correct. So Webb made a copy of the key while he was working on the house. Then he was arrested and went to prison. When he got out a year ago, he still had the key. He came back to retrieve the equipment. But the equipment wasn't there anymore, he said. Someone else must have found it and removed it. That's the puzzle, Detective Martinez said. We need to figure out what happened to the equipment between the time it was hidden and the time Webb came back for it. He thought about this. The equipment had been hidden in the basement behind the boxes about 18 years ago. It had stayed there for years. But at some point, it had been removed. The space behind the boxes was now empty. He searched for information about the previous owners again. Patricia and Robert Morrison. They'd owned the house for 8 years before he bought it. Before them, James and Helen Garrett had owned it for 12 years. He searched for Helen Garrett. He found a few references in old newspaper articles about community events and charity functions. Helen Garrett had been involved in local organizations, but nothing that seemed connected to the stolen equipment. Then he searched for Robert Morrison. He found a LinkedIn profile that listed Morrison as a contractor and handyman. The profile had been inactive for several years, but it showed that Morrison had worked on various residential projects in the area. He called Detective Martinez and told her about Morrison's background as a contractor. That's interesting, she said. Morrison would have had the knowledge and skills to access hidden spaces in the house. He might have discovered the equipment while doing work on the property. And he might have removed it, he said. He might have stolen it from the basement. That's possible. Let me try to contact Robert Morrison and see if he's willing to talk to us. Detective Martinez called back the next day. I found Robert Morrison, she said. He's living about an hour away. When I asked him about the equipment, he initially denied knowing anything about it. But when I told him that we had evidence of a break-in at the property, he became more cooperative. What did he say? He admitted that while he was renovating the basement about 15 years ago, he found a hidden compartment behind the water heater. Inside the compartment were boxes of electronics equipment. He said he didn't know what it was or where it came from, so he removed it and sold it to a scrap metal dealer. 15 years ago. That would have been about 3 years after the original theft. Morrison had found the equipment and sold it as scrap. Did he remember the scrap dealer's name? He asked. He said it was a local business that's no longer in operation, but he does remember getting paid about $2,000 for the equipment. So the stolen equipment had been found, removed, and sold for scrap. It was probably melted down or dismantled by now, completely unrecoverable. Webb didn't know any of this, Detective Martinez said. He spent all those years in prison thinking the equipment was still hidden in your basement. When he got out, he came back to retrieve it, only to find that it was gone. That's why he broke in, he said. He was looking for the equipment. When he couldn't find it, he looked for the photos to see if there were any clues about what had happened to it. Exactly. And when he couldn't find the photos or the equipment, he left without taking anything. Detective Martinez said she was going to file charges against Marcus Webb for the break-in and for making an unauthorized copy of the key. She said she would also be reopening the original theft investigation, though it was unlikely that any new charges would be filed given how much time had passed. "What about Robert Morrison?" he asked. "He sold stolen property." "That's a gray area," Detective Martinez said. "Technically, he purchased stolen property, but he claimed he didn't know it was stolen. Without evidence that he knew the equipment was stolen, it's difficult to prosecute. I'll mention it to the district attorney, but I suspect they won't pursue charges at this point." Over the next week, Detective Martinez provided him with updates. Marcus Webb had been arrested at his residence with the key to his house still in his possession. Webb had admitted to the break-in and had explained that he'd been looking for equipment that he believed had been hidden in the basement. Webb had also admitted to his involvement in the original theft with James Garrett 18 years ago. He said that Garrett had promised him a share of the proceeds from selling the equipment, but Garrett had disappeared before they could sell it. Webb had spent years trying to locate the equipment, and when he got out of prison, he decided to break in and retrieve it himself. Webb is now facing charges for the break-in, burglary, and fraud, Detective Martinez said. He's also being charged with making an unauthorized copy of a key with intent to commit a crime. Given his prior conviction, he's looking at several years in prison. The case was closed. The mystery was solved. But as he sat in his house a week later, he found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to the break-in. 18 years ago, James Garrett and Marcus Webb had stolen equipment from Midwest Electronics. They'd hidden it in the basement, behind a false compartment near the water heater. Garrett had settled the lawsuit and sold his business. Webb had waited for his chance to retrieve the equipment, but Garrett had disappeared. 15 years ago, Robert Morrison had discovered the hidden compartment while renovating the basement. He'd removed the equipment and sold it as scrap, never knowing it was stolen. The money he'd received had probably been spent long ago. Then, 5 years ago, Marcus Webb had worked on the house as a contractor. He'd made a copy of the key, planning to return later to retrieve the equipment. He'd been arrested before he could do so. A year ago, Webb had been released from prison. He'd come back to the house, using his copied key to let himself in. He'd spent 4.5 hours searching the basement, looking for the equipment that was no longer there. He'd moved the boxes, hoping to find the hidden compartment. He'd looked through the house, searching for any clues. He'd removed photos from the albums, hoping they might show where the equipment had been hidden. And then he'd left, locking the door behind him, leaving only a dragging mark on the concrete and a disturbed air filter as evidence of his intrusion. The utility spike had been caused by Webb using power tools, probably a flashlight and an electric drill, to search the basement. The 4.5 hours had been spent methodically going through the space, trying to find something that had been gone for 3 years. He walked through his house one more time, looking at it with new understanding. The basement, the bedroom closet, the photo albums, all of it had been touched by someone searching for something that didn't exist anymore. He thought about calling the Morrisons to let them know what had happened, but he decided against it. They'd already moved on with their lives. They'd sold the house, and the equipment had been gone for years before they'd even discovered it. He thought about contacting James Garrett, but he had no idea where Garrett was or if he was even still alive. Garrett had disappeared years ago, probably taking whatever money he'd made from the original theft with him. And Marcus Webb was now back in prison, serving time for a crime that had been committed nearly 2 decades ago. The equipment he'd spent so much time looking for had been melted down and turned into new products long ago. The case was closed, but the story didn't feel finished. It felt like a circle that had finally completed itself, with everyone involved moving on to other things, other lives, other crimes and mistakes. He changed the locks on his house again, even though Webb was now in custody. He installed a security system, the one he declined 4 years ago when Marcus Webb had come to his house to provide an estimate. He put cameras in the basement and the hallway, watching for any sign of intrusion. And he kept the utility bill on his kitchen counter, a reminder of the night when someone had broken into his house and searched for something that was no longer there. A reminder that every house had a history, and sometimes that history could reach back and touch you in unexpected ways. He thought about the photo albums, about the images that had been carefully removed. He wondered what those photos had shown. Had they documented the hidden compartment? Had they shown the equipment before it was hidden? Or had they simply been photos of his house, taken at a time when it was someone else's property, someone else's responsibility? He would never know. The photos were gone, and the people who might have been able to answer his questions were either dead, disappeared, or imprisoned. But he understood now what had happened. He understood the chain of events that had led to the break-in. And he understood that sometimes the most interesting mysteries were the ones that had the simplest explanations: greed, desperation, and the passage of time. Detective Martinez called one more time, about a week after Webb's arrest. "I wanted to let you know that we found some additional evidence," she said. "When we searched Webb's residence, we found documents related to the original theft. He'd kept detailed records of the equipment that was stolen, including photographs and serial numbers. He'd also been keeping track of the property records for your house, monitoring each change of ownership. He was watching the house all those years," he said. "Yes, he was waiting for an opportunity to retrieve the equipment. When he got out of prison, he decided to take the chance." "Do you think he knew that the equipment was no longer there?" "I don't think so. I think he genuinely believed it was still hidden in the basement. He was shocked when he couldn't find it. That's probably why he spent so much time searching. He was trying to figure out what had happened to it." After hanging up, he went to the basement one more time. The dragging mark on the concrete was still visible, though it had faded slightly over the past week. He looked at the space behind the boxes, at the clean patch of concrete where something had been stored for years. He thought about the equipment that had been hidden there. Electronics components, probably. Valuable at the time, but now obsolete. The technology had moved on. The components had been melted down and turned into new products. The theft had been forgotten, except for the people involved. And now, 18 years later, someone had broken into his house searching for something that no longer existed. The equipment was gone, the people involved were scattered, and the house had moved on to new owners and new histories. He pulled the boxes back into place, covering the clean patch of concrete. He went upstairs and sat at the kitchen table, looking at the utility bill one more time. The numbers were still there, still documenting that spike in electricity consumption on the night of March 12th. But now he understood what had caused it. He understood the story behind the numbers. And he understood that every house, every property, every piece of real estate carried with it a history that was often hidden beneath the surface. People came and went, leaving behind only traces of their presence. Sometimes those traces were obvious: a dragging mark on concrete, a disturbed air filter, missing photos from albums. And sometimes they were invisible, known only to the people who had lived through them. He had been lucky. He had been able to piece together the story, to understand what had happened and why. But he knew that for most people, for most homeowners, the mysteries of their houses would remain unsolved. They would notice small oddities, things slightly out of place, small damages, inexplicable where, and they would wonder about them without ever finding answers. He had found his answer. Marcus Webb had broken into his house, searching for stolen equipment that had been hidden in the basement nearly 2 decades earlier. The equipment was no longer there, but Webb hadn't known that.